Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Emma of Normandy, the remarkable woman who shaped English history for half a century and became known as the Double Queen. Through her marriages to two English kings, we'll softly explore her incredible story, from her birth as a Norman princess in the twilight years of the 10th century, through her strategic marriages to King Æthelred the Unready and King Cnut the Great, and finally to her powerful role as mother and queen mother to two more English kings, all while the Viking Age transformed into the medieval world we know. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video and leave a gentle comment about which part of Emma's story fascinates you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 11th century England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Emma, later known as Queen Emma of Normandy, Elfgifu of England, and the Double Queen, came into this world sometime around the year 984, in the final decades of the 10th century, though the exact date and even the exact year of her birth have been lost to the mists of time that obscure so much of the distant past. The medieval chroniclers who recorded the births of kings and princes rarely bothered to note with precision the arrival of daughters, even daughters born to powerful families. And so Emma's birth was not marked with the same careful attention that would have been given to a male heir. She was born in the Duchy of Normandy, that powerful and fascinating region along the northern coast of France that had been carved out by Viking warriors barely a century before her birth, and which would one day give its name to one of the most famous conquests in all of European history. Normandy in the late 10th century was a land of contrasts and contradictions, a place where Norse traditions mingled with French culture, where Viking longships still sailed from harbours, but where French was increasingly the language of the court, where warrior values coexisted with growing Christian piety. The duchy itself was relatively young, established in the year 911, when the Frankish King Charles the Simple had granted lands along the Seine River to a Viking chieftain named Rollo in exchange for his promise to defend the French coast against other Viking raiders. This arrangement, formalized in the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, had created Normandy as a distinct political entity, neither fully French nor fully Norse, but something uniquely its own. By the time Emma was born, Normandy had existed for about 70 years, long enough to develop its own identity, but recent enough that memories of its Viking founding were still very much alive. Emma's father was Richard I, known to history by the epithet Richard the Fearless, although whether this name referred to his courage in battle or to the fear he inspired in his enemies is a matter of some debate among historians. Richard had become Duke of Normandy at a young age, inheriting the position from his father William Longsword, who had been assassinated when Richard was still a child. The young Duke had survived plots and rebellions, had fought off attempts by French kings to absorb Normandy back into their kingdom, and had emerged as one of the most powerful and successful rulers in northern France. Richard the Fearless was a complex figure, typical of the Norman aristocracy of his time. He was a Christian, baptized and raised in the faith, yet he retained many of the values and practices of his Viking ancestors. He was ruthless when necessary, capable of great violence in pursuit of his political goals, and yet he was also a patron of monasteries and churches, generous in his donations to religious institutions. He ruled his duchy with a firm hand, brooking no opposition from rebellious vassals, yet he also understood the importance of diplomacy and alliance building. Emma's mother was Gunora, Richard's second wife, a woman whose origins remain somewhat mysterious and contested among historians even today. Some sources suggest that Gunora came from relatively humble origins, perhaps even from among the common people, though this seems unlikely given the social conventions of the time which would have made such a marriage scandalous for a duke. Other sources, probably more reliable, indicate that Gunora was herself of Viking or Danish descent, perhaps the daughter of a Danish warrior or merchant who had settled in Normandy. What is clear is that Richard was deeply attached to Gunora, that their marriage was a genuine partnership, and that she bore him several children who would play important roles in the history of Normandy and England. Through her mother Gunora, Emma inherited a connection to the Danish world, to the same Viking culture that was at that very moment launching devastating raids against England. This heritage would prove deeply ironic in the years to come, for Emma would spend much of her life caught between Viking raiders and the English kingdom they sought to conquer, trying to navigate between these two worlds to which she was connected by blood and by marriage. Emma grew up in the ducal court, most likely in Rouen, the capital of Normandy, a thriving city that sat along the Seine River and served as the center of Norman political, economic, and cultural life. Rouen, in the late 10th century, was a city of perhaps 10,000 inhabitants, substantial for the time, with stone buildings interspersed among wooden structures, with a great cathedral that was still being rebuilt after earlier Viking raids had damaged it, with busy markets where merchants from across Europe came to trade their goods. The ducal palace in Rouen, where Emma spent her childhood, would have been an impressive structure, though probably not as grand as the castles and palaces that would be built in later centuries. It would have had thick stone walls for defense, a great hall where the duke held court and feasted with his nobles, private chambers for the ducal family, a chapel where religious services were held daily, storerooms and kitchens, stables for horses, and quarters for the numerous servants and retainers who attended the duke and his family. Life in the ducal palace would have followed a structured routine shaped by the rhythms of medieval Christianity and the demands of aristocratic governance. The day would begin early, with the ringing of church bells calling the household to morning prayers. Emma, from her earliest years, would have been expected to attend these religious services, to learn the prayers and responses, to absorb the teachings of the church that were considered essential for every Christian soul. As a daughter of the Duke, Emma would have received an education fitting for a princess of her time and station. This education would have been conducted primarily by clerics and learned monks who served the ducal household, men who had themselves been educated in monastery schools and who understood the importance of learning for those who would one day need to navigate the complex world of medieval politics and governance. Emma would have learned to read and write in Latin, the language of the church, of learning, and of international diplomacy. This was no small accomplishment. Most people in the medieval world, even most nobles, were illiterate. The ability to read opened up worlds of knowledge to Emma, giving her access to the scriptures, to the lives of saints, to the writings of the church fathers, and to the chronicles and histories that preserved knowledge of the past. Her education would have included extensive religious instruction. She would have learned the stories of the Bible, from the creation in Genesis, through the life and teachings of Christ, to the prophecies of Revelation. She would have studied the lives of saints, those holy men and women whose devotion to God had earned them a place in heaven and whose intercession could help the living. She would have learned the prayers of the church, the liturgy of the Mass, the meaning of the sacraments. But Emma's education was not purely religious or academic. She would have learned the practical skills necessary for managing a great household, for a noblewoman in the medieval world was expected to be capable of overseeing estates, managing servants, organizing feasts and ceremonies, and handling the complex logistics of an aristocratic establishment. She would have learned about textiles and clothing, about food and cooking, about herbs and medicines, and about the management of money and resources. She would have learned needlework, a skill considered essential for noble ladies who were expected to produce elaborate embroidered garments and decorative cloths. Medieval needlework was not merely decorative, it was an art form, and skilled needlewomen were highly valued. Emma would have spent many hours with needle and thread, learning different stitches and techniques, creating beautiful objects that displayed both her skill and her wealth. Music was another important part of her education. She would have learned to sing, particularly the chants and hymns of the church, and perhaps she learned to play some musical instrument, though the records do not tell us specifically what instruments she might have mastered. Music was considered both a pleasure and a form of worship, and a way to praise God through beautiful sounds. Emma would also have learned the courtly manners and behaviors expected of someone of her rank. She would have been taught how to move with grace and dignity, how to speak appropriately to people of different ranks, how to conduct herself at feasts and ceremonies, how to display the bearing of a princess. These lessons in deportment and behavior were not trivial. In the medieval world, how one behaved was a reflection not just on oneself, but on one's entire family, and a princess who behaved inappropriately could bring shame on her father and her dynasty. But perhaps the most important lesson Emma learned during her childhood, though it was probably never stated explicitly as part of her formal education, was the harsh reality of her position as a duke's daughter in the medieval world. She was, in the most practical and unavoidable sense, a valuable political asset, a piece on the chessboard of medieval diplomacy and statecraft. Her beauty, her education, her royal blood, all of these were commodities that could be used to advance her family's interests. Emma would have understood from an early age that her marriage would not be a matter of personal choice or romantic love. She would be married to advance her father's political goals, to forge alliances, to cement treaties, to bring the Duchy of Normandy into closer relationship with other powerful realms. This was the fate of almost every noble daughter in medieval Europe, and Emma would have known it from her earliest years, would have watched as other noble girls in her father's court were married off to distant strangers. I would have heard the whispered conversations about which princes and lords might make suitable husbands. This knowledge must have been both sobering and frightening for a young girl. To know that someday, perhaps soon, you would be sent away from everything familiar, sent to marry a man you had never met, sent to a foreign land where the language and customs would be strange. This was not a pleasant prospect. Yet Emma would also have been taught to see it as her duty, as the contribution she could make to her family's power and security, as the role that God and fate had assigned to her. Emma had siblings who would play important roles in the story to come, forming a tight-knit family network that would prove crucial during some of the most difficult moments of her life. Her brother Richard, several years younger than Emma, and would eventually succeed their father as Duke of Normandy, ruling as Richard II. The bonds between Emma and Richard seemed to have been strong, and in years to come, Richard would prove a crucial ally and protector during some of the darkest moments of Emma's life, offering her sanctuary when she had nowhere else to turn. She had another brother, Robert, who entered the church and eventually became Archbishop of Rouen, one of the most important ecclesiastical positions in Normandy. Having a brother in such a powerful church office would prove advantageous for Emma, giving her family connections within the religious establishment that governed so much of medieval life. There may have been other siblings as well, though the records are incomplete, and historians are not entirely certain about the full extent of Emma's family. And growing up in the Norman court, Emma would have been surrounded by the fascinating blend of cultures that characterized Normandy in the late 10th century. the Norman nobility still told stories of their Viking ancestors, still valued the martial prowess and seafaring skills that had made the Northmen so formidable. Yet they had also adopted much from French culture, the French language, French customs, French styles of governance and warfare. And over all of this lay the influence of Christianity, which was transforming these former Vikings into pious Christian princes. The Normandy of Emma's childhood was a duchy on the rise, growing in wealth, power, and influence. Her father, Richard the Fearless, had worked tirelessly to strengthen Norman power, to centralize his control over the various nobles who ruled different parts of the duchy, to build churches and monasteries, to encourage trade and commerce. He had been largely successful in these efforts, and by the time Emma was growing up, Normandy was becoming one of the most prosperous and well-governed territories in France. The duchy's wealth came from multiple sources. Agriculture was important, as it was everywhere in the medieval world, with Norman peasants farming the fertile lands along the Seine and other rivers, growing wheat and other grains, raising sheep and cattle. But Normandy's position on the coast gave it access to maritime trade as well. Norman ships sailed the seas, trading with England, with the Frankish kingdoms, with the Mediterranean world. Norman ports bustled with activity, with merchants buying and selling wool, wine, grain, fine cloth, spices, and all the other commodities that moved through medieval trade networks. This wealth allowed Norman dukes to be generous patrons of the church, and Richard the Fearless used his riches to found and support monasteries and churches throughout his duchy. He brought in learned monks to establish monastery schools where young men could be educated. He sponsored the copying of manuscripts, helping to preserve ancient knowledge and religious texts. He rebuilt churches that had been damaged in earlier conflicts. This religious patronage served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the duke's piety, it won him the support of church leaders, and it helped to spread Christianity and literacy throughout his domain. Yet this same Normandy, pious and prosperous though it was becoming, and also maintained close connections with the Viking world from which it had sprung. Norman ports often sheltered Viking fleets during the winter months, when sailing the northern seas became too dangerous, and when Viking raiders needed a place to rest and resupply between their summer raiding seasons. These fleets, having spent the warmer months attacking England, Scotland, Ireland, or other targets, would come to Norman harbours seeking shelter. This practice created enormous tension between Normandy and England. The English kings naturally resented this Norman hospitality toward their enemies, and there were frequent diplomatic protests and threats. Why, the English asked, would supposedly Christian dukes shelter these pagan pirates who burned English churches and monasteries? The Norman response was usually evasive. The dukes claimed they could not prevent ships from seeking shelter in their harbours, or that they were trying to convert these Vikings to Christianity, or that the relationship between Normandy and these raiders was not as close as the English alleged. But in truth, the situation was complicated. Some of these Viking raiders were distantly related to the Norman ducal family, sharing common Norse ancestry. Others were trading partners, bringing goods that Norman merchants wanted to buy. Some may even have been paying the Norman dukes for the privilege of using Norman harbours as bases. Whatever the exact nature of these relationships, they represented a continuing link between Normandy and the Scandinavian world, a link that would have profound consequences for Emma's life. As Emma grew from childhood into adolescence during the 990s, the situation in England across the English Channel was deteriorating rapidly and dramatically. The English kingdom was suffering terribly from Viking raids that seemed to grow worse with each passing year. The English King Æthelred, who had come to the throne as a young man in 978 after the mysterious murder of his half-brother Edward the Martyr, found himself increasingly unable to defend his kingdom effectively against the Viking warriors who struck again and again at English shores. These were not the occasional raids that England had experienced in earlier decades. These were systematic, devastating attacks that showed clear signs of organization and planning. Viking fleets, sometimes numbering dozens or even hundreds of ships, would arrive at English coasts in the spring or summer. They would land their forces, establishing fortified camps from which they could operate. Then they would spread out across the countryside, attacking towns and villages, burning churches and monasteries, killing those who resisted, carrying off captives to be sold as slaves, and gathering enormous quantities of plunder. The psychological impact of these raids on the English population must have been terrible. Imagine living in a village near the coast, never knowing when Viking longships might appear on the horizon, never knowing when warriors might come storming through your village with swords and axes, burning your home, killing your neighbors, perhaps killing you or carrying you away to slavery in some distant land. Even those who survived unharmed would have their crops destroyed, their livestock slaughtered or stolen, their churches burned, their communities devastated. The English kingdom under Æthelred seemed almost paralyzed in its response to these attacks. The king would gather armies, but they rarely achieved decisive victories. Sometimes the English forces would win small battles or skirmishes, but these successes never translated into lasting peace or security. More often, the English would simply pay the Vikings to go away, handing over enormous sums of silver in the hope that the raiders would take their money and leave. These payments, known as danegeld, were raised through crushing taxation that made King Æthelred increasingly unpopular with his own people. English landowners and peasants found themselves being taxed heavily to pay off raiders who might simply return next year, demanding even more money. The system seemed designed to fail, to create a cycle in which paying the raiders only encouraged more raids, each one demanding higher payments than the last. Æthelred's inability to effectively resist these attacks earned him one of the most famous and unfortunate nicknames in English history, the Unready. But this nickname is actually a corruption and mistranslation of his Old English name. In Old English, Æthelred meant noble counsel, and the nickname Unread meant no counsel, or evil counsel, or ill-advised, so the name is actually a play on words. Æthelred Unread essentially means noble counsel the ill-advised, a cutting commentary on the king's poor judgment and worse results. By the year 1000, the situation had reached a crisis point. Viking fleets were using Normandy as a winter haven, resting there between raids on England, and King Æthelred was desperate to stop this practice. Some sources suggest that Æthelred may have even attempted some kind of military action against Normandy itself, though the details are murky and disputed among historians. What is clear is that both the English king and the Norman duke realized they needed to find some way to ease the dangerous tensions between their realms before their conflict spiraled into open warfare. The solution they arrived at was a time-honored method of medieval diplomacy that had been used countless times throughout history, a marriage alliance. By marrying the English king to a Norman princess, and both sides hoped to create family bonds that would prevent conflict and encourage cooperation. For Æthelred, such a marriage held the promise that the Normans might stop sheltering his Viking enemies, or at least be less hospitable to them. For Duke Richard of Normandy, the marriage offered a way to maintain good relations with his powerful English neighbour and to protect his duchy from English retaliation. And so, sometime in the year 1001 or early 1002, negotiations began for a marriage between King Æthelred of England and Princess Emma of Normandy. These negotiations would have been conducted by envoys travelling back and forth across the English Channel, carrying proposals and counter-proposals, hammering out the details of this all-important alliance. For Emma, and this negotiation meant her fate was being decided in discussions between powerful men, in rooms and councils where she had no voice and no presence. She was probably somewhere between 15 and 18 years old, still very young by modern standards, though not unusually so for a royal bride of her era. Medieval marriages among the nobility typically happened early, often in the teenage years, both because life expectancy was shorter than today, and because political alliances needed to be formed quickly in a world where circumstances could change rapidly. The man she was to marry, King Æthelred, was approximately 20 years older than she was, probably somewhere in his mid to late 30s. He was a widower who had already fathered numerous children by his first wife, and a woman named Elfgifu of York, who had died or disappeared from the historical record around the year 1000. These children included several sons, who were nearly Emma's own age, young men who would have to view any new queen as a potential threat to their own claims to the throne. The negotiations for the marriage must have taken several months, for these were complex arrangements that touched on numerous sensitive issues. Emma's dowry would need to be agreed upon. What wealth and property would she bring to the marriage from her Norman family? This was important not just for financial reasons, but also as a measure of respect and status. A larger dowry indicated that the bride's family valued the match highly and that they considered the bride herself to be valuable. More importantly, terms would need to be set regarding Emma's position as queen. What rights would she have? What properties would she receive? What would be her status and authority? These were not trivial questions. Queens could wield considerable power and influence, or they could be marginalized and ignored depending on the specific arrangements made at the time of marriage. And most crucially, what about the inheritance rights of any sons Emma might bear? This was particularly sensitive because Æthelred already had several sons from his first marriage, and these princes would naturally view any new sons as potential rivals for the throne. The question of succession needed to be addressed carefully to prevent future conflicts. Would Emma's sons have equal claim to the throne with the sons of Æthelred's first wife? Would they come after those older sons in the line of succession? Or might they somehow be placed ahead of them? In the spring of 1002, after months of negotiation, the arrangements were finally complete and agreements were signed. Emma prepared to leave the only home she had ever known, to say farewell to her father Richard the Fearless, to her mother Gunora, to her brothers Richard and Robert, to the familiar surroundings of the Norman court, where she had spent her entire life. She would be crossing the English Channel to a foreign land whose language she did not speak, whose customs would be strange to her, and where she would have to navigate the dangerous waters of a royal court filled with political intrigue and family rivalries. The journey across the English Channel must have been both exciting and terrifying for the young Norman princess. Even in calm weather, crossing the Channel was not a trivial undertaking in the early 11th century. The ships of the time were sturdy enough for the voyage, but they were still at the mercy of wind and weather, and many a traveller had been lost to storms or shipwrecks. Emma travelled with an entourage of Norman nobles and servants, people who would help her adapt to her new life and who would serve as her connection to her homeland. These attendants were carefully chosen. They needed to be loyal to Emma, capable of helping her navigate English court politics, and acceptable to the English. Some would stay with Emma for the rest of her life, becoming key members of her household and her most trusted advisors. Yet others would eventually return to Normandy after helping Emma establish herself in her new home. She brought with her magnificent gifts for her new husband and his court, treasures that would display the wealth and power of Normandy, and that would serve as her introduction to the English nobility. These gifts might have included fine textiles, gold and silver objects, jeweled ornaments, illuminated manuscripts, perhaps horses or hunting dogs or falcons. Medieval diplomacy relied heavily on the exchange of gifts, and the quality and quantity of Emma's gifts would have been carefully calibrated to make the right impression. Emma arrived in England in the early spring of 1002, and on the 5th of April of that year, she was married to King Æthelred at Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, and one of the most important cities in the English kingdom. The choice of Winchester as the site for the wedding was significant. It was the traditional seat of the West Saxon kings, the place where many earlier English monarchs had been crowned and buried, a city with deep symbolic importance for English royalty. Winchester, in the early 11th century, was a substantial city by the standards of the time, perhaps home to 8,000 or 9,000 people. It sat in a valley surrounded by gentle hills, with the river Itchen flowing through it, providing water for the inhabitants and power for mills. The city had Roman origins. It had been called Venta Belgarum by the Romans, and Roman walls still surrounded parts of it, though much of the original fortifications had been rebuilt and reinforced over the centuries. The marriage ceremony itself would have been a magnificent affair, conducted with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a royal wedding. It would have taken place in the Old Minster, the great cathedral church of Winchester, a building that had been standing for hundreds of years and that was associated with some of England's greatest kings. The church would have been specially decorated for the occasion, with fine hangings on the walls, flowers and greenery brought in to beautify the space, candles providing light. Emma would have worn her finest clothes for the ceremony, probably a long gown of rich fabric, perhaps silk or fine wool, dyed in expensive colours like deep blue or rich red or royal purple. Her hair would have been elaborately arranged, possibly braided and coiled, adorned with gold ornaments. She would have worn jewels, necklaces, bracelets, rings, brooches, all designed to display her wealth and status. Despite being a bride leaving her homeland, she would have been dressed to impress, to show the English nobility that she was worthy of being their queen. King Æthelred too would have been magnificently dressed, wearing his crown and royal regalia, surrounded by his greatest nobles and churchmen. The ceremony itself would have been conducted in Latin by the Bishop of Winchester, or perhaps by the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, following the ancient rituals of Christian marriage. Prayers would have been said, blessings given, vows exchanged, rings placed on fingers. Immediately after the marriage ceremony, or perhaps on the following day, came Emma's coronation as Queen of England, and this was a significant detail that showed Emma's elevated status and the importance of this marriage alliance. Not all royal wives received coronation. The fact that Emma did suggest that this was specifically negotiated as part of the marriage agreement, probably insisted upon by her brother Duke Richard, to ensure his sister's dignity and position as a legitimate, anointed queen, rather than merely the king's wife. The coronation ceremony would have been solemn and sacred, filled with religious symbolism. Emma would have been anointed with holy oil, consecrated as queen, blessed by the church. A crown would have been placed upon her head, not merely a decorative circlet of gold, but a sacred symbol of her royal authority. She would have been given other symbols of queenship as well, perhaps a scepter or rod to hold, and perhaps a ring symbolizing her marriage to the kingdom as well as to the king. At her coronation, Emma received a new name, following an English custom for foreign queens. She was given the Anglo-Saxon name Elfgifu, a name that meant something like elf gift in Old English, a poetic and lovely name that would be used in official documents and formal occasions throughout her life in England. This practice of giving foreign queens English names was not uncommon. It helped to integrate them into their new kingdom and to present them as truly English queens rather than foreign princesses. It symbolized their adoption into the English royal family and their acceptance of English customs and loyalties. However, Emma herself apparently preferred her Norman name, and in later years, and particularly in the Encomium Emmae Reginae that she would commission, she would refer to herself as Emma rather than Elfgifu. This preference suggests something interesting about Emma's identity. Even after decades in England, she retained a sense of herself as Norman, as the daughter of Richard the Fearless, as someone whose roots lay across the Channel in Normandy. Along with her crown and her new name, Emma received substantial property and wealth as part of her marriage settlement. As dower, the property a wife receives from her husband that is hers to control during her lifetime, Emma was given estates in Winchester, Rutland, Devonshire, Suffolk, and Oxfordshire. She also received the city of Exeter, one of the most important cities in the southwest of England, at an ancient place that had been a Roman settlement and that had grown into a prosperous trading centre. These properties were not merely sources of income for Emma, though they certainly provided her with considerable wealth. They were also power bases, places where she could exercise authority, where she could appoint her own officials, where she could build networks of loyalty and obligation. Medieval queens who controlled substantial property were far more influential than those who depended entirely on their husbands for support. Emma's extensive dower meant she would be a wealthy, independent woman, not merely an appendage to the king. But Emma's new life in England began under a dark and terrible shadow, a shadow that would haunt her relationship with England and with the English people for years to come. Just 7 months after her wedding, on the 13th of November 1002, one of the most shocking and brutal events in English history took place, an event that would have devastating consequences for England, and that may have troubled Emma deeply given her own background and heritage. King Æthelred, apparently acting on information or rumours that Danish settlers in England were plotting against him, perhaps planning an uprising or coordinating with Viking raiders from across the sea, issued orders for what would become known to history as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. The 13th of November was the feast day of St. Brice of Tours, a 5th century French bishop, and so this terrible day of violence took its name from the saint whose feast it ruined. Æthelred's orders were stark and brutal. On this single day, English forces were to kill all the Danes living in England, or at least all those Danes living in areas outside of the Danelaw, the region of northern and eastern England where Danish settlement was most concentrated and where Danish law and customs were officially recognised. The king's written orders for this massacre, which survive in historical records, speak of destroying all the Danes in England like weeds among the wheat, a chilling metaphor that dehumanized the victims and presented their killing as a kind of agricultural necessity, like pulling up unwanted plants from a field. The massacre was carried out with terrible efficiency in many parts of England. English forces moved through towns and villages, hunting down anyone identified as Danish or suspected of having Danish ancestry. The violence was indiscriminate and brutal, extending even to women and children, to people whose families had lived in England for generations, to Christians who worshipped in English churches, but who happened to have Danish blood or Danish names. In Oxford, Danish men, women, and children sought sanctuary in a church, believing that the sacred nature of the building would protect them from violence. But their English attackers were undeterred by the sanctity of the place. Unable or unwilling to drag the Danes out of the church, the English simply set fire to the building, burning it to the ground with the Danes still inside. Archaeological excavations in Oxford in later centuries would find the burned remains of St. Frideswide's church, destroyed in this terrible act of violence. The massacre was probably not as comprehensive as Æthelred had intended. In the Danelaw, where Danish settlers were numerous and powerful, The king's orders may not have been enforced at all, or were enforced only partially. In other areas, some Danes may have been warned and escaped. Some English officials may have been reluctant to carry out such brutal orders. But even a partial implementation of Æthelred's command resulted in enormous bloodshed and suffering. Among the victims of the St. Brice's Day massacre was a woman named Gunhilda, who was the sister of Svein Forkbeard, the King of Denmark, and one of the most powerful rulers in Scandinavia. Gunhilda had apparently married an English nobleman and had been living peacefully in England, perhaps even serving as a kind of informal hostage to ensure good behaviour between England and Denmark. But on St. Brice's Day, she was murdered along with her husband and their child, killed despite her royal status, despite any promises of safety that may have been given to her. Svein Forkbeard's reaction to his sister's murder can easily be imagined. He was already a formidable enemy of England, having launched raids against the English coast in previous years. But now he had a personal vendetta, a blood debt that demanded payment. Svein would spend the rest of his life, more than a decade, seeking vengeance for his murdered sister, launching increasingly devastating attacks on England, attacks that would ultimately culminate in his conquest of the entire kingdom. For Emma, the St. Brice's Day massacre must have been deeply shocking, and perhaps personally troubling in ways that went beyond the obvious horror of such mass violence, as she herself carried Danish blood through her mother Gunora, who was believed to be of Danish descent. The wholesale slaughter of people who shared her ancestry, people who might have been distantly related to her own family, would have been disturbing. She had come to England as a bridge between England and Normandy, as a peace weaver who was supposed to help create understanding and cooperation between different peoples. Instead, her arrival had been followed almost immediately by one of the worst acts of ethnic violence in English history. Did Emma know about the massacre in advance? Did Æthelred consult her before issuing his orders? Did she try to dissuade him or to moderate the violence? The historical record is silent on these questions, preserving no information about Emma's reaction or involvement. But given that she was a new bride, barely 7 months in England, still learning the language and the customs, still finding her place in the English court, it seems unlikely that she was deeply involved in the decision. More probably, she learned about the massacre after it had already happened, confronted with this terrible fait accompli that she was powerless to undo. The immediate consequences of the St. Brice's Day massacre were severe. Far from solving England's problems with Danish raiders, the massacre intensified them. Svein Forkbeard became even more determined to attack England, and his subsequent raids were marked by particular savagery, as if he were trying to extract vengeance for his murdered sister and her family. The massacre also damaged England's relationships with other Scandinavian powers and undermined whatever fragile peace had existed. And the massacre raised a troubling question about the marriage alliance that had brought Emma to England. One of the purposes of her marriage had been to reduce tensions and create better relationships between England and the Scandinavian world through Norman mediation. But by ordering the massacre just months after the wedding, Æthelred had essentially thrown away any benefits the alliance might have brought. One can only wonder what Duke Richard thought when he heard the news, whether he felt betrayed or simply resigned to the impossibility of creating lasting peace in such troubled times. Despite this inauspicious and troubling beginning, and Emma worked to settle into her role as Queen of England during the months and years that followed. She would have spent her time adapting to English customs, learning the English language, which was quite different from the French she had grown up speaking, managing her extensive properties, and dealing with the complex politics of the English court. Learning English must have been challenging for Emma. Old English, the language spoken in England in the early 11th century, was a Germanic language, quite different in vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation from the Romance languages like French that Emma knew. It would have taken months or years for her to become truly fluent, and she probably retained a Norman accent throughout her life. But learning the language was essential. She needed to be able to communicate with her English servants and officials, to understand what was being said at court, to participate in the governance of her estates. Emma also had to navigate the complex and potentially hostile territory of Æthelred's existing family. As mentioned earlier, Æthelred had numerous children from his first marriage to Elfgifu of York. Historians are not entirely certain how many children there were. Medieval record-keeping was inconsistent, but there were at least 6 sons and several daughters. Some of these children were nearly Emma's own age, which must have made relationships particularly awkward. The oldest surviving son when Emma arrived was probably Æthelstan, followed by Edmund, who would later be known as Edmund Ironside, Edred, Edwig, Edgar, and Edmund. There were also daughters, though less information survives about them, since daughters were generally considered less important in royal succession. These children and their various supporters would naturally have viewed Emma with suspicion and resentment. She was a foreign interloper, a Norman interloper specifically, bringing with her the possibility that she might bear sons who would challenge the existing prince's claims to the throne. Emma also had to deal with various factions at the English court, nobles who had their own agendas, churchmen who wielded great influence, advisors who competed for the king's favour. Medieval royal courts were hotbeds of intrigue, places where reputations could be made or destroyed, where the wrong word to the wrong person could have serious consequences. Emma, and as a foreign queen still learning the language and customs, had to navigate these treacherous waters carefully. And there was her relationship with King Æthelred himself to manage. What was this marriage like? The sources give us little information about the personal dynamics between Emma and her first husband. Theirs was obviously a political marriage, arranged for reasons of state, not a love match. Æthelred was 20 years older than Emma, already middle-aged by medieval standards when they married. He had already been king for more than 20 years, already had a large family, already had established habits and ways of doing things. Did they develop any affection for each other? Did they find companionship in their marriage? Or was it merely a formal arrangement, with Emma and Æthelred maintaining a courteous but distant relationship? We simply do not know. The Encomium Emmae Reginae, which Emma would later commission, says almost nothing about Æthelred. It barely mentions him at all, referring to him only as a certain Prince of London, not even naming him as king or as Emma's husband. This striking omission might suggest that Emma did not have fond memories of her first marriage, or it might simply reflect the political purposes for which the encomium was written. What we do know is that Emma fulfilled the primary duty of a medieval queen. She bore children. Around the year 1003, Emma gave birth to her first child, a son who was christened Edward. This boy would eventually become King Edward the Confessor, and who would ultimately be canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, was Emma's great hope for the future. As her firstborn son, Edward represented the culmination of the marriage alliance between Normandy and England, a living symbol of the peace that was supposed to exist between the two realms. The birth of a son was always an important event in the medieval world, but the birth of a prince was particularly significant. Elaborate celebrations would have marked Edward's birth, church services giving thanks to God, feasts celebrating the new prince, gifts distributed to mark the joyous occasion. Emma, having successfully borne a male heir, would have seen her status and security enhanced. She had proven herself capable of bearing sons, which was considered one of the most important duties of a queen. About a year later, Around 1004, Emma bore a daughter, whom she named Godgifu, and though this name is sometimes given in the Latinized form, Goda, in historical sources, daughters were valued less than sons in the medieval world. They could not inherit thrones or fight in battles, but they were not unimportant. Daughters could be married off to form additional political alliances, creating family ties with other powerful families. Godgifu would eventually be married several times, each marriage serving to advance political interests, though the details of her life are less well documented than those of her brothers. But even as Emma was establishing her family and her household, even as she was adapting to her new role and her new home, the situation in England was deteriorating rapidly and dramatically. The Viking raids that had plagued the country for decades were intensifying and becoming larger and more devastating with each passing year. And leading many of these raids was Sweyn Forkbeard himself, still burning with rage over the murder of his sister in the St. Brice's Day massacre, still determined to extract revenge against King Æthelred and the English kingdom. The raids brought destruction to many parts of England, including to some of the very properties that Emma had been given as her dower. Her city of Exeter, that important trading centre in the southwest, was attacked and sacked during one of these raids. Viking warriors stormed through the city's streets, looting homes and shops, carrying away treasures, perhaps burning buildings. The city's defences were overcome, its inhabitants killed or enslaved or forced to flee. For Emma, the sack of Exeter must have been personally troubling, and this was her city, given to her as part of her marriage settlement, a source of income, and a symbol of her status as queen. To have it devastated by raiders was both a financial loss and a blow to her dignity and authority, and there was probably nothing she could do about it. She could not personally lead armies to defend Exeter, could not rebuild what had been destroyed, could only watch helplessly as Viking raiders undid in a few days of violence what had taken years to build. The raids also brought enormous suffering to the English people. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered or stolen. Churches and monasteries, which often held the wealth of their communities in the form of gold crosses, jeweled reliquaries, and precious manuscripts, were particular targets, and the Vikings had no respect for Christian sanctuaries. They would burst into churches during services, killing priests at the altar, stealing sacred objects, burning irreplaceable manuscripts that had taken monks years to copy. The psychological impact of these raids was perhaps even worse than the physical damage. People lived in constant fear, never knowing when a Viking fleet might appear. Farmers were afraid to work their fields, worried that warriors might appear at any moment. Merchants were afraid to transport goods, fearing that their caravans might be attacked. The normal rhythms of life were disrupted by the constant threat of violence, and Æthelred's response to these raids continued to be inadequate and ineffective. He would gather armies, but they rarely achieved anything, and sometimes the English forces would march around ineffectually, unable to bring the Vikings to battle or to prevent their raids. Other times, they would be defeated in actual combat, their soldiers fleeing or being cut down by the better organized and more experienced Viking warriors. More often, Æthelred would simply resort to his usual strategy of paying the Vikings to go away. The Danegeld payments grew larger with each passing year. In 1007, Æthelred paid £36,000 of silver to buy off the raiders. 2 years later, in 1009, when a particularly large Viking army arrived under the command of a leader named Thorkel the Tall, the situation became even more desperate. Thorkel's army was formidable, one of the largest Viking forces ever to attack England. His warriors spread across the country in 1009, 1010, 1011, and 1012, and devastating region after region. They defeated English armies sent against them. They captured and sacked important cities. They burned churches and monasteries. They carried off enormous quantities of plunder and large numbers of captives. In September 1011, the Vikings besieged and captured Canterbury itself, one of the most important cities in England, the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the head of the English Church. The Viking forces stormed into the city, overwhelming its defences. They captured the Archbishop, a man named Æthelred, and held him for ransom. Æthelred was a saintly man, respected even by many of the Vikings. But when the English could not or would not pay the enormous ransom demanded for him, the Vikings became angry. In April 1012, at Greenwich, the Vikings gathered for a feast and drinking heavily, as was their custom. As they drank, they began tormenting their captive archbishop, throwing bones and ox heads at him. Finally, one Viking, taking pity on the archbishop, or perhaps simply wanting to end the humiliation, killed Æthelred with an axe blow to the head. The archbishop became a martyr, eventually canonized as a saint, but his death was a symbol of how completely England seemed to be at the mercy of its enemies. Finally, in 1012, Æthelred managed to buy off this particular Viking army, paying them the staggering sum of £48,000 of silver. To put this in perspective, this was probably several times the normal annual income of the entire English kingdom. The taxation necessary to raise such a sum was crushing, and it made Æthelred even more unpopular with his people, who must have wondered what good it did to have a king if he could only respond to threats by paying enormous bribes. In the midst of these troubled times, probably around the year 1012, Emma gave birth to a third child, another son, whom she named Alfred. This boy, known to history as Alfred Ætheling, Ætheling being an Old English word meaning a prince of royal blood, one who was theoretically eligible to become king, would meet a tragic and horrible fate later in life. Though as an infant sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, his future suffering was still mercifully hidden. With the birth of Alfred, Emma had now given Æthelred 2 sons and a daughter, fulfilling her primary duty as queen. Her sons Edward and Alfred, along with their half-brothers from Æthelred's first marriage, meant that England had multiple potential heirs, and which should have provided security for the royal line. But this abundance of princes also meant potential for conflict, for disputes over succession, for civil war between different claimants to the throne. By 1013, the situation in England had become truly desperate. The Viking attacks were no longer mere raids. They had become a full-scale invasion, an attempt at complete conquest. And leading this invasion was Sweyn Forkbeard himself, the King of Denmark, the man who had been seeking revenge for his sister's death for more than a decade. Sweyn arrived with a massive army, the largest force he had ever brought to England. His goal was no longer to extract tribute or to gather plunder. He intended to conquer England entirely, to drive Æthelred from the throne, and to claim the kingdom for himself. And incredibly, and against all expectations, Sweyn succeeded with remarkable speed and apparent ease. Landing in the north, Sweyn quickly received the submission of the people of the Danelaw, those regions where Danish settlers were numerous, and where memories of the St. Brice's Day massacre were still fresh. These people had no love for Æthelred, the king who had tried to massacre them, and they were willing to accept a Danish king as their ruler. With the north secured, Sweyn moved south. One region after another submitted to him, recognizing him as their king. English resistance, such as it was, crumbled before him. Some areas submitted without even attempting to fight. Others put up brief resistance before being overwhelmed. The speed of Sweyn's conquest suggests that there was very little will among the English to fight for Æthelred, and that the king's subjects had lost faith in his ability to protect them, and were willing to accept almost any alternative. Æthelred, unable to mount an effective defense of his kingdom, unable even to hold his capital, was driven from London and from England entirely. The king, who had ruled England for more than 30 years, was reduced to a refugee, fleeing before the Danish invader, abandoning his throne and his kingdom. Emma, acting apparently on her own initiative and showing the political acumen and decisiveness that would characterize her throughout her life, fled to Normandy with her 3 young children before the situation became completely untenable. She did not wait for her husband to make decisions for her or to tell her what to do. She assessed the situation, recognized the danger, and took charge of her own safety and that of her children, escaping to her brother Richard's protection while such escape was still possible. Emma's flight to Normandy was not a simple or easy journey. She had to gather her most important possessions, knowing that she might not be able to return to England for a long time, if ever. She had to arrange for travel across the Channel in the midst of winter, which was the most dangerous time for sea voyages, when storms were frequent and when many ships were lost. She had to ensure the safety of her 3 young children: Edward, who was about 10 years old, Godgifu, who was around 9, and little Alfred, who was barely 2 years old. She was accompanied by some of her loyal English and Norman attendants, people who were willing to leave England and follow their queen into exile. She brought with her what portable wealth she could manage: gold and silver objects, jewels, perhaps important documents and charters that proved her rights to her English properties. She could not bring her lands or estates, of course. Those remained in England, now under the control of Sweyn Forkbeard, but she could bring movable wealth that might sustain her during her exile. The crossing of the Channel in winter must have been dangerous and frightening, particularly with 3 young children to worry about. Medieval ships were sturdy enough to make the crossing, but they were still vulnerable to the winter storms that could blow up suddenly in the Channel. Many travelers were lost to shipwrecks or were blown far off course, ending up in strange ports far from their intended destinations. But Emma and her children made it safely to Normandy. Her brother Richard II, their father Richard the Fearless, had died in 1996, and young Richard had inherited the duchy, received his sister and her children warmly at the Norman court. Despite the political purpose of Emma's marriage to Æthelred, despite the fact that the marriage had not achieved its goal of ending Viking raids or improving relations between England and the Scandinavian world, there seems to have been genuine affection between the siblings. Richard was prepared to provide his sister and her children with shelter and support for as long as necessary. He gave them comfortable quarters in his ducal palace. He provided them with servants and attendants. He ensured they had food, clothing, and everything else they needed. For Richard, providing this shelter was both a family duty and a political calculation. By sheltering Emma and her children, he was positioning himself and Normandy as potential players in English politics, keeping open the possibility that Emma's sons might one day claim the English throne. The children would be safe in Normandy, away from the violence and chaos consuming England. They could be educated properly, learning the skills and knowledge they would need if they ever did return to England as princes or even as king. Edward, Godgifu, and Alfred would grow up speaking French as their first language, more familiar with Norman customs than with English ones, shaped by their exile into people who were as much Norman as English. For Emma herself, the exile must have been a time of uncertainty and anxiety, mixed with relief at being safe. On the one hand, she was back in familiar surroundings, in the land of her birth, able to speak her native language, reunited with her family. On the other hand, she had lost everything she had built in England over the previous 11 years: her position as queen, her wealth and properties, her place in English politics and society. Æthelred himself soon joined Emma in exile. Driven from his kingdom, the king who had ruled England for decades was now a refugee in a foreign land, dependent on the hospitality of his wife's brother. The situation must have been humiliating for Æthelred, a constant reminder of his failures as king. And one can only imagine what the relationship was like between Æthelred and Duke Richard during this exile. Richard had given his sister in marriage to Æthelred as part of an alliance meant to bring peace and security. Instead, Æthelred had proven unable to defend his kingdom, had presided over the St. Brice's Day massacre that had made the situation worse, and had ultimately lost his crown to Danish invaders. Richard must have felt that his sister's marriage had been a waste, that all his hopes for the alliance had come to nothing. The exile in Normandy lasted through the winter of 1013 and into early 1014. Emma, Æthelred, and their children lived in uncertainty, not knowing if they would ever return to England, or if Swine Forkbeard's conquest would prove permanent. Emma, still only in her late 20s, must have wondered if the queenship she had worked to establish would be lost forever, or if her children would grow up as landless exiles rather than English princes and princesses, if her own future would be spent in Normandy rather than in the English court, where she had hoped to exercise power and influence. But fate intervened in an unexpected and dramatic way. On the 3rd of February, 1014, Swine Forkbeard died suddenly at Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. The Danish conqueror, who had finally achieved his goal of seizing the English throne, who had driven his enemy Æthelred into exile, who had avenged his murdered sister, held the crown of England for barely 5 weeks before death took him. The cause of his death is not recorded. Perhaps illness, perhaps an accident, perhaps simply the natural end of a life that had been filled with warfare and hardship. Sweyn's sudden demise threw the Danish conquest into confusion. His son, a young man named Cnut, who was in his late teens or early 20s, was with the Viking army in England. Cnut was proclaimed as Sweyn's successor by the Vikings, but he was young and relatively untested, without the reputation and authority that his father had built over decades of warfare and rule. Many of the Danish forces began to reconsider their position, wondering if this young and unproven leader could really hold England against English resistance. Moreover, Sweyn's death removed the personal element of vengeance that had driven much of the Danish hostility toward England. Sweyn had been seeking revenge for his murdered sister, but Cnut, though he may have felt some family obligation to continue his father's work, did not have the same burning personal vendetta driving him. And the Danish warriors who made up the army were mercenaries and adventurers as much as they were conquerors. They had followed Sweyn for the prospect of plunder and land, but with Sweyn dead, they might be willing to make deals or even to leave England entirely if the price was right. News of Sweyn's death reached Normandy quickly, probably within days, and Æthelred immediately saw an opportunity. He sent messages to England, reaching out to English nobles and churchmen, gauging their willingness to accept his return. The response he received must have been gratifying. Many of the English nobles, when they learned of Sweyn's death, sent messages to their exiled king, saying they would accept him back. But significantly, these nobles attached conditions to their acceptance. They would accept Æthelred as king again, they said, but only if he promised to govern better than he had before. They wanted him to address their grievances, to rule more justly, to be more effective in defending the kingdom. In essence, they were demanding better governance as the price for their continued loyalty. These conditions were remarkable for their time. Medieval kingship was usually seen as divinely ordained. Kings ruled because God had chosen them, and subjects owed obedience as a religious duty. But here were English nobles formally demanding that their king govern according to their expectations, making his restoration conditional on his promises to reform. These conditions were written down and preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, making them one of the earliest examples in English history of nobles formally demanding accountability from their monarch. Æthelred, desperate to regain his throne, and perhaps also genuinely chastened by his experiences, agreed to the terms. Whether he intended to keep his promises is doubtful. Æthelred's track record of following through on commitments was not good, but he made the promises nevertheless, swearing to be a better king than he had been before. And so, in the spring of 1014, Emma returned to England with her husband and their children. They found a country that had been ravaged by years of warfare, its treasuries depleted by enormous Danegeld payments, its people exhausted and traumatized. Many towns and villages were damaged or destroyed. Fields had gone unplowed and unplanted during the chaos, meaning that harvests were poor. The economy was shattered, trade was disrupted, and everywhere there were signs of the suffering that decades of warfare had inflicted. Cnut and his Viking forces, finding themselves in a suddenly precarious position after Sweyn's death, had retreated from much of England. They maintained control of some areas, particularly in the north where Danish settlement was strong, but they no longer controlled the entire kingdom. Æthelred was able to re-establish himself in London and in the southern parts of England, and for a brief time, it seemed as if his restoration might be successful. But the return to England did not bring peace or stability, or the fresh start that might have been hoped for. Æthelred, despite his promises, quickly fell back into his old patterns of ineffective governance. Young Cnut, far from giving up his claims to England, was merely regrouping and gathering his forces for a return that would be even more devastating than his father's invasion. For Emma, the restoration to England meant she was once again queen, once again mistress of her properties and estates, once again an important figure in English politics. But it also meant returning to all the problems and dangers that had forced her to flee in the first place. Her husband was still ineffective, still unable to defend his kingdom adequately. The threat of renewed Viking invasion still loomed, and the English court was still full of factions and rivalries, of nobles pursuing their own agendas, of family tensions between Emma's children and Æthelred's children from his first marriage. During the next 2 years, from 1014 to 1016, Emma must have watched with growing anxiety and perhaps despair as the situation in England continued to deteriorate. Her husband's health was declining, his physical vigour waning, his ability to govern weakening with each passing month. The kingdom was fractured. The tensions within the royal family during these years were particularly acute and troubling. Among Æthelred's sons from his first marriage, several stood out as capable and ambitious young men who were coming into their own just as their father's power was waning. The oldest of these sons who survived into the crisis years was Æthelstan, who had been designated as heir apparent and who seems to have been respected by many English nobles. But Æthelstan died in June of 1014, just a few months after Æthelred's return from exile, removing what might have been a stabilizing force in the succession. With Æthelstan's death, the next oldest surviving son, Edmund, became the leading prince among Æthelred's children from his first marriage. Edmund was a very different man from his father. Where Æthelred was hesitant and indecisive, Edmund was bold and energetic. Where Æthelred preferred to pay off his enemies, Edmund wanted to fight them. Where Æthelred had lost the confidence of many of his subjects, Edmund was earning a reputation as a warrior and leader. He would later earn the nickname Ironside for his courage and strength in battle, for his refusal to yield to enemies, for his determination to resist the Danish invaders no matter what the cost. But Edmund was also at odds with his father, frustrated by Æthelred's ineffective leadership and angry at the way the kingdom was being governed. The relationship between father and son was strained and difficult, marked by disagreements and tensions that sometimes erupted into open conflict. Edmund wanted to take aggressive action against the Danes, to lead English armies in battle, to show strength rather than weakness. Æthelred, worn down by years of failure and loss, seems to have been unable or unwilling to support his son's more aggressive approach. For Emma, Edmund's prominence must have been concerning. Edmund was not her son. He was the son of Æthelred's first wife, and as such, he had no particular loyalty to Emma or to her interests. If Edmund became king, what would happen to Emma's own sons, Edward and Alfred? Would they be relegated to secondary status, perhaps even exiled or eliminated as potential rivals? And these questions must have troubled Emma as she watched the political situation develop. Emma's attempts to secure a place in the succession for her son Edward had not been successful. Although Emma and some of her supporters had tried to have Edward recognized as heir after Æthelstan's death, this effort was opposed by Edmund and his supporters, and the opposition was strong enough that Edward's claim was set aside. The reality was clear. Emma's sons came after Æthelred's sons, from his first marriage in the line of succession, and as long as those older sons were alive and capable, Edward and Alfred would not be seriously considered as heirs to the throne. In 1015, the fragile peace that had existed since Æthelred's return from exile shattered completely. Cnut, who had spent the previous year gathering forces and preparing for a new invasion, returned to England with a formidable army. This time, Cnut was not just his father's lieutenant or a junior commander. He was the leader, the king in his own right, and he brought with him warriors who were loyal to him personally, who had chosen to follow him on this campaign of conquest. Cnut's strategy in 1015 was different from his father's approach in 1013. Rather than trying to win quick submission through shows of force, Cnut set out to systematically conquer England region by region, defeating English forces in battle, winning over English nobles to his side through a combination of threats and promises, establishing firm control over each area before moving on to the next. It was a slower approach than his father's rapid conquest, but it proved more durable and more successful in the long run. The English response to Cnut's invasion was hampered by internal divisions and by Æthelred's continuing weakness as a leader. Different English nobles pursued different strategies. Some wanted to fight the Danes. Others wanted to negotiate. Some were even willing to defect to Cnut's side, judging that the Danish prince was more likely to protect their interests than the failing English king. Edmund Ironside emerged as the leading military commander on the English side, gathering forces and leading them in battle against the Danes. He proved himself a capable warrior, winning some engagements and earning the respect of his soldiers. But his efforts were undermined by his father's interference, by the lack of coordination among English forces, and by the willingness of some English nobles to betray their own side for personal advantage. One particularly notorious case of betrayal involved a man named Edric Streona, the Earl of Mercia, who was one of Æthelred's chief advisors and who had been married to one of Æthelred's daughters from his first marriage. Edric was a powerful noble who controlled large parts of central England, and his support was crucial to any English military effort. But Edric was also ruthless and unscrupulous, willing to change sides whenever he thought it would serve his interests. During the conflicts of 1015 and 1016, Edric would switch sides multiple times, first supporting Æthelred, then defecting to Cnut, then returning to the English side, then defecting again. His betrayals undermined English military efforts and cost English lives. Edmund apparently despised Edric and would later try to have him removed from positions of power, but Æthelred continued to rely on this treacherous advisor, perhaps because he had no better alternatives, or perhaps because he had simply lost the ability to judge character accurately. Æthelred's health continued to decline throughout 1015 and into early 1016. The king, who had ruled England for nearly 4 decades, was now in his late 40s or early 50s, not particularly old by modern standards, but elderly by medieval reckoning, especially for someone who had lived through so many years of stress and conflict. He was ailing, his physical vigor sapped, his mental acuity perhaps declining, his ability to govern effectively almost gone. Emma must have watched her husband's deterioration with mixed emotions. On one level, she was witnessing the suffering of a man to whom she had been married for 14 years, the father of her 3 children, and some compassion for his condition would be natural. But on another level, she must have been deeply concerned about what his death would mean for her and for her children. Edmund seemed poised to inherit the throne, and Edmund was not her son. If Edmund became king, what would happen to Edward and Alfred? What would happen to Emma herself? On the 23rd of April, 1016, St. George's Day, the feast day of England's patron saint, which seemed fitting for the death of an English king, Æthelred died in London. He had ruled England for 37 years and some months, one of the longest reigns in English history up to that point, but it was also one of the most troubled reigns, marked by constant warfare, devastating defeats, crushing taxation, and ultimately the loss of the kingdom itself to Danish invaders. Æthelred's death was probably not unexpected by this point, given his declining health, but it still threw the political situation into even greater confusion. Emma was now a widow, no longer queen consort, but rather a dowager queen, the widow of the dead king. Her position was suddenly much less secure than it had been. She had no formal role in government, no automatic claim to continued influence or power. Everything would depend on who became the next king and what that king decided to do about his father's widow and his half-brothers. Edmund Ironside was immediately proclaimed king by those English nobles and soldiers who were with him, and he took the name Edmund II. At 30 or so years of age, Edmund was in his prime, vigorous and determined to continue the fight against Cnut. He had his father's stubbornness, but also a courage and military capability that Æthelred had lacked. Under different circumstances, Edmund might have been an effective king, might have been able to rally English resistance and drive back the Danish invaders. But circumstances were not favourable to Edmund. Large portions of England were already under Cnut's control. Many English nobles had already submitted to Cnut, or were wavering in their loyalties. The treasury was depleted from years of Danegeld payments. The people were exhausted from years of warfare, and Edmund had perhaps 6 months to try to turn the situation around before events would overtake him. The spring and summer of 1016 saw intense fighting between Edmund's forces and Cnut's army. Edmund proved himself a capable and courageous warrior, leading his troops from the front, winning several battles through his personal bravery and tactical skill. He earned his nickname Ironside during these months, as English soldiers watched him fight with apparent fearlessness, refusing to yield even in the face of overwhelming odds. But military success in individual battles was not enough to change the overall strategic situation. Cnut controlled too much territory, had too many warriors, had won over too many English nobles, and Edmund's forces were undermined by continued treachery from people like Edric Striona, who seemed to switch sides whenever it suited him, disrupting English military plans and sowing distrust among Edmund's commanders. Emma's role during these months of warfare is unclear. The sources tell us little about what she was doing, where she was living, what decisions she was making. Was she in London, watching as armies marched back and forth? Was she at Winchester, managing her properties and trying to maintain some stability in her household? Was she already contemplating what she might do if Edmund lost and Cnut won? One theory suggested by some historians is that Emma may have been in London when Cnut laid siege to the city in 1016, and that she may have played some role in the city's resistance, perhaps helping to organize the defense or encouraging the citizens to hold out. The evidence for this is thin and disputed, but it would fit with Emma's character, as we know it from other points in her life. She was not a woman to sit passively while events unfolded around her, but rather someone who took action, who made decisions, who tried to shape outcomes. The decisive moment came on the 18th of October, 1016, at a place called Asandun, which historians usually identify with Ashington in Essex, though the exact location has been debated. There, Edmund Ironside and Cnut met in a great battle that would decide the fate of England. Both sides brought large forces to the field. Both kings were present, commanding their armies personally. The fighting was fierce, brutal, and prolonged, with neither side willing to yield. During the battle, according to some sources, Edric Streona, who was supposedly fighting on Edmund's side, committed one final act of treachery. He and his forces withdrew from the battle at a crucial moment, leaving Edmund's flank exposed and undermining the English battle line. Whether this was a planned betrayal or simply a battlefield decision made in the confusion of combat is unclear, but the result was the same. The English line broke, the battle turned against Edmund, and when the day ended, Cnut had won a decisive victory. Many English nobles and warriors died at Asandun. The battlefield would have been covered with corpses, with wounded men crying out for help, with the wreckage of broken weapons and shattered shields. Survivors on the English side fled, their army broken, their king defeated. Edmund himself survived the battle and managed to escape with some of his remaining forces, but his position was now hopeless. After the Battle of Asandun, Edmund and Cnut met to negotiate. Neither side had the strength to completely destroy the other at this point, and Edmund still controlled some parts of England and had loyal forces, but he had been decisively defeated and lacked the resources to continue the war indefinitely. Cnut had won the battle and controlled most of England, but completely conquering the remaining English-held territories would require more fighting and more losses. The two kings agreed to partition England between them. Edmund would hold Wessex, the ancient heartland of English power in the south and west, the region from which the kings of England had originally come. This was the richest and most important part of what remained of English territory. Cnut would rule the rest of England, the north, the east, the Midlands, essentially everything except Wessex. But there was a crucial additional clause in their agreement. Whichever king outlived the other would inherit the entire kingdom. The partition was temporary, lasting only until one of the kings died. This agreement must have seemed reasonable at the time. Both kings were young men, both in their 20s or early 30s. There was no particular reason to think that one would die soon, while the other survived. The partition might have lasted for decades, might have eventually evolved into a permanent division of England into two separate kingdoms. But fate had other plans. On the 30th of November, 1016, barely 6 weeks after the Battle of Asandun, barely a month after the partition agreement was signed, Edmund Ironside died. He was probably only about 30 years old, in apparently good health, and his death was sudden and unexpected. Some medieval sources hint darkly at murder, suggesting that he was assassinated by agents of Cnut or by English nobles who preferred Danish rule. Other sources suggest he died of wounds received at Asandun that had seemed minor but that became infected. Still others suggest natural causes, perhaps an illness that struck quickly and fatally. The truth about Edmund's death is lost to history, and we will probably never know with certainty what killed him. But what is clear is that his death solved Cnut's problem. The young Danish king was now the undisputed ruler of all England, the partition agreement having become moot with Edmund's demise. There was no longer any English king to challenge his authority, no English royal army to resist his rule. England had fallen to Danish conquest, and Cnut was its new master. For Emma, Edmund's death was both a disaster and a strange opportunity. On one hand, the English dynasty to which she had been connected through her marriage to Æthelred was now broken. Æthelred was dead, Edmund was dead, and the other sons of Æthelred's first marriage were either dead, in exile, or soon to be eliminated by Cnut. The world Emma had known for the past 14 years had come to an end. On the other hand, Emma still had resources and options. She was the anointed and crowned Queen of England. Regardless of whether her husband was alive or dead, she controlled substantial property and wealth, or at least she had legal claim to such property, even if Cnut now physically controlled it. She was the sister of Richard II, Duke of Normandy, one of the most powerful rulers in France, or she was the mother of two princes, Edward and Alfred, who could theoretically claim the English throne, even if their claim was currently unenforceable. Emma faced a choice. She could flee to Normandy again, taking her sons back into exile, hoping that someday circumstances would change and they might be able to reclaim their father's throne. This would be the safe choice, the cautious choice, the choice that would protect her immediate physical safety, but it would also mean abandoning her position in England, losing her properties and wealth, consigning herself and her sons to indefinite exile with no clear path back to power. Or Emma could stay in England and try to make some kind of accommodation with the new Danish king. This was the risky choice, the bold choice, and the choice that might lead to disaster, but that might also preserve her position and her influence. And it was the choice that Emma made. What happened next was one of the most surprising and controversial developments in Emma's entire remarkable life. Rather than fleeing from Cnut or being imprisoned or exiled by him, rather than becoming a victim of the conquest, Emma instead married Cnut. The marriage took place in July of 1017, less than 8 months after the death of Emma's first husband Æthelred, less than a year after Edmund Ironside's death at Assunden. Medieval sources give conflicting accounts of how this marriage came about, and historians have debated the circumstances ever since. Some sources suggest that Emma was in London when Cnut conquered the city, and that Cnut had her brought to him and married her, implying that this was at least partially forced on Emma's part. Emma's own version of events, written down years later in the Encomium Emmae Reginae that she commissioned, claims that she was in Normandy at this time, and that Cnut sent envoys to her, asking for her hand in marriage, suggesting that Emma was a more active participant in the arrangement. The truth probably lies somewhere between these accounts. It seems likely that there were negotiations between Cnut and Emma, possibly through intermediaries, in which both parties assessed what they could gain from a marriage and what terms would be acceptable. Emma was not in a position to demand much. She was the widow of the defeated and dead English king. Her political position was weak, and she needed Cnut more than he needed her. But she was not entirely without bargaining power either. She was still the crowned Queen of England. She had connections to Normandy, and marrying her could help legitimize Cnut's rule. For Cnut, marrying Emma brought several clear advantages. First, and most obviously, Emma was the anointed Queen of England, crowned and legitimate. By marrying her, Cnut was connecting himself to the previous English dynasty, creating a sense of continuity rather than complete rupture. He was not merely a foreign conqueror who had seized the throne by force, but rather the husband of England's rightful queen, someone who could claim to rule with legitimacy. Second, marrying Emma maintained and strengthened the alliance with Normandy that Emma's first marriage had been intended to create. Duke Richard II of Normandy was a powerful ruler whose friendship or enmity could matter greatly. By marrying Richard's sister, Cnut was ensuring that Normandy would not become a base for English exiles plotting against his rule, and might even actively support his regime. Third, marrying Emma might have been seen by some English nobles as a gesture of reconciliation, a sign that Cnut intended to rule as an English king, respecting English customs and institutions, not as a foreign tyrant. The marriage showed that Cnut was willing to work with existing English power structures and to incorporate English traditions into his rule. Fourth, and perhaps most practically, Emma was wealthy. She owned extensive properties throughout England, properties that would now come under Cnut's indirect control through their marriage. Her dower lands, which she had received from Æthelred, represented a substantial economic asset. For Emma, the decision to marry Cnut was more complex and has been debated by historians ever since. Some historians have suggested that she had no real choice, that she was compelled to marry Cnut by force or overwhelming political pressure. But this seems unlikely for several reasons. Emma was a member of the powerful Norman ducal family, and forcing her into marriage could have provoked serious diplomatic consequences, possibly even Norman military action against Cnut. Moreover, if Cnut had simply wanted to eliminate Emma as a potential threat, he could have imprisoned her, exiled her, or even had her killed. Forcing her into marriage was not necessary for his security. More likely, Emma made a calculated political decision to marry Cnut because it served her interests. What were those interests? First and foremost, marrying Cnut allowed Emma to retain her position as Queen of England. She did not have to flee into exile, did not have to abandon her properties and her status, did not have to admit defeat and retire to Normandy as a failed and powerless widow. By marrying Cnut, she remained queen, retained access to wealth and power, and continued to be a significant figure in English politics. Second, marrying Cnut may have been the best way, perhaps the only way, to protect her sons, Edward and Alfred. These boys were potential claimants to the English throne, which made them potential threats to Cnut. In the brutal politics of the time, such threats were often eliminated permanently. Æthelred's son, Edwig, from his first marriage, was declared an outlaw and was soon murdered, probably on Cnut's orders. Æthelred's grandsons, the sons of Edmund Ironside, were sent to Sweden with instructions that they be killed, though fortunately they survived because the Swedish king refused to murder innocent children. But according to later sources, part of Emma's marriage agreement with Cnut included a crucial provision. Any sons that Emma bore to Cnut would take precedence in the succession over Cnut's children from previous relationships. This clause was enormously important. It meant that Emma could have another chance to place a son of her own on the English throne. Her sons by Æthelred, Edward and Alfred would be sent to safety in Normandy, removed from immediate danger. But if Emma bore a son to Cnut, and that boy would be the designated heir to both England and Denmark, positioned to become one of the most powerful rulers in Northern Europe. This was a gamble on Emma's part. She was trading her son's immediate claims to the throne for their physical safety, combined with the possibility that a future son might inherit instead. But it was probably the best deal she could get in her circumstances, and it showed her political acumen and her willingness to make difficult choices in pursuit of her goals. To ensure the safety of her sons Edward and Alfred, Emma sent them to live in Normandy under the protection of her brother, Duke Richard. The boys, now teenagers, Edward was about 14 and Alfred was about 5, would grow up as Norman princes, educated in Norman ways, speaking French as their native language, and far removed from England and from English politics. This separation must have been painful for Emma. She was sending her children away, perhaps not knowing if she would ever see them again. But she clearly judged it necessary for their survival. Cnut already had a wife of sorts when he married Emma. Her name was Ælfgifu of Northampton, and she was an English noblewoman from a powerful family in the north of England. Ælfgifu had already borne Cnut at least one son, possibly two. The older son was named Harold, who would later be known as Harold Harefoot. There may have been a younger son as well, named Svein or Swine. Ælfgifu's relationship with Cnut was what was called a handfast marriage, or a Danish marriage, a form of union that was recognized in Danish custom and tradition, but that was not fully blessed by the Christian Church. In Scandinavian society, such marriages were considered legitimate, and the children born from them were legitimate heirs. But in Christian canon law, these unions were problematic. They were not blessed by a priest, not conducted according to church ritual, not considered proper Christian marriages. This distinction allowed Cnut to marry Emma in a fully Christian ceremony, without technically being guilty of bigamy, though the situation was legally and morally murky and controversial. The church might have objected to this arrangement, but Cnut was now a powerful king, and the church was not in a position to make strong demands of him. And for political purposes, Cnut probably wanted a Christian marriage to Emma. It would be recognized throughout Christian Europe as legitimate, giving stronger legitimacy to any children born from it. But Ælfgifu of Northampton did not simply disappear when Cnut married Emma. She remained part of Cnut's life, and her sons, particularly Harold Harefoot, were recognized by Cnut as his children. This created a complicated family situation with enormous potential for future conflict. Emma's children by Cnut would have half-brothers who might also claim their father's throne. Harold Harefoot and Svein were older than any sons Emma might bear to Cnut, and in many succession systems, older sons had priority regardless of the status of their mother's marriage. The stage was set for future succession disputes, and Emma must have been keenly aware of this from the very beginning of her marriage to Cnut. The marriage agreement supposedly gave precedence to Emma's children, but would this agreement be respected after Cnut's death? Would Harold Harefoot accept being passed over in favour of a younger half-brother? Would Ælfgifu of Northampton accept that her son was not to inherit his father's throne? These questions could not be answered in 1017, but they would become crucial in the years after Cnut's death. Emma became Queen of England for the second time through her marriage to Cnut in July 1017. But her queenship under Cnut would be very different from her queenship under Æthelred. With her first husband, Emma had been somewhat marginalized, a foreign queen trying to find her place in an English court dominated by her husband's children from his first marriage, and by advisors who had been there long before she arrived. With Cnut, Emma would become far more powerful, far more central to governance, far more influential in political decisions. But Emma's queenship under Cnut was also different because Cnut himself was not merely King of England. In 1018, when Cnut's older brother Harold died, Cnut inherited the Kingdom of Denmark, making Emma Queen of Denmark as well as England. This gave Emma an unprecedented status. She was queen of two of the most important kingdoms in northern Europe, ruling over a realm that stretched from the North Sea to the Baltic. Around 1017 or 1018, Emma gave birth to Cnut's son, whom they named Harthacnut. This name, which means something like tough knot or hard knot in Old Norse, was distinctly Danish, reflecting the boy's Scandinavian heritage through his father. But through his mother, Harthacnut was also Norman and had claims to English traditions. He was a bridge between different worlds, just as his mother had been. Why, as Emma's son by Cnut and protected by the marriage agreement that gave him precedence in the succession, Harthacnut was positioned from birth as the probable heir to both England and Denmark. Emma must have seen in this baby boy the fulfillment of her hopes for her family's future. If Harthacnut inherited both kingdoms, he would be one of the most powerful rulers in all of Europe, and Emma would be the queen mother of this great king. Emma also bore Cnut a daughter named Gunhilda. Less is recorded about Gunhilda than about her brother Harthacnut. Daughters were generally less important than sons in medieval dynastic politics, but Gunhilda would eventually make a brilliant marriage to Henry, son of Conrad II, the Holy Roman Emperor, and this match showed just how far Cnut's ambitions extended and how important Emma's children had become in the political landscape of Northern Europe. For Gunhilda to marry into the imperial family meant that the descendants of Emma and Cnut would be connected to the highest levels of European aristocracy. Emma's position under Cnut grew stronger with each passing year. Early in their marriage, her name appears relatively low on official documents, suggesting that she did not yet have a great deal of formal authority. But gradually, her position rose. By the later years of Cnut's reign, Emma's name was being placed on royal charters just below the king's own, an unprecedented position for a queen. This placement indicated that Emma was not merely the king's wife, but was in some sense his partner in governance, and someone with real authority and power. What exactly was Emma's role in governing England during Cnut's reign? The sources do not give us a detailed picture, but we can piece together some idea from scattered references and from the general patterns of royal administration. Queens in the medieval world typically had several important functions. They managed royal households, which were large and complex operations involving hundreds of servants and retainers. They acted as intercessors, people to whom petitioners could appeal when they wanted the king's favor or mercy. They served as regents when kings were absent or incapacitated, and they participated in royal councils, advising the king on decisions and helping to build political consensus. Emma probably fulfilled all of these roles to some degree. She certainly managed a substantial household. Queens had their own servants, their own officials, their own estates to administer. She probably acted as an intercessor, receiving petitions from people who wanted her to speak to Cnut on their behalf. She almost certainly served as regent at times when Cnut was absent from England, which happened frequently given the size of his realm, and she likely participated in royal councils, offering advice and helping Cnut navigate the complex politics of ruling multiple kingdoms. Emma also became extraordinarily wealthy during Cnut's reign, probably the richest woman in England and perhaps in all of Northern Europe. She retained the dower properties she had received from Æthelred, the estates in Winchester, Rutland, Devonshire, Suffolk, Oxfordshire, and the city of Exeter. To these were added additional properties and income sources that Cnut granted her. Her land holdings were extensive, stretching across England, generating substantial rents and revenues. This wealth gave Emma real power. Medieval political power was closely tied to economic resources. A person who controlled land controlled the people who lived on that land, controlled the agricultural production of that land, could offer rewards and positions to supporters, could build networks of loyalty and obligation. Emma's wealth meant she could maintain her own followers, could reward those who served her, could exert influence through her patronage. She was not dependent on Cnut for every penny. She had her own independent economic base. Emma used her wealth to become a great patron of the church and continuing and expanding the religious patronage she had begun during her first marriage. She and Cnut together worked to repair the immense damage that had been done to English churches and monasteries during the decades of Viking raids. Many religious houses had been burned, their treasuries looted, their populations of monks killed or scattered. Emma and Cnut provided funds to rebuild burned buildings, to re-establish monastic communities, to refill church treasuries. They made generous donations to religious institutions throughout England and beyond. They gave precious gifts to churches, golden crosses encrusted with jewels, silver altar vessels, fine vestments embroidered with gold thread, illuminated manuscripts copied by skilled scribes. They endowed monasteries with land and income. They supported the copying of religious texts, helping to preserve Christian learning and scripture. Emma was particularly generous to the churches of Winchester, which had become her favoured city, the place she seemed to consider most truly her home. She made donations to both the Old Minster and the New Minster, the two great cathedral churches of Winchester. She gave land to support monks and clergy. She commissioned the creation of beautiful objects for church use. Her patronage helped make Winchester one of the most important religious centres in England. This religious patronage served multiple purposes, as patronage always did in the medieval world. First, and most obviously, it was an expression of genuine piety. Emma, like most people of her time, was sincerely religious, believed in God and in the teachings of the Church, and wanted to earn spiritual merit through good works and generous giving. She believed that her donations would benefit her soul, would help her achieve salvation, would earn her prayers and intercessions from grateful monks and clergy. Second, religious patronage helped Emma and Cnut win the favour and support of the Church, which was crucial for their legitimacy as rulers. The Church controlled much of the intellectual and cultural life of England. Bishops and abbots were important political figures whose support or opposition could matter greatly. By being generous to the Church, Emma and Cnut ensured that clergy would speak well of them, would support their rule, would present them to their congregations as good Christian monarchs deserving of obedience. Third, religious patronage helped to reconcile the English people to Cnut's rule. Here was a Danish king, a descendant of Viking raiders who had burned English churches and killed English monks, now rebuilding those same churches and supporting those same religious communities. The irony was not lost on anyone, but it worked. Cnut's generosity to the Church helped transform him in English eyes from a foreign conqueror into a legitimate Christian king who respected English traditions and holy places. In 1031, Emma achieved another remarkable honour that reflected her unprecedented status. She became the first English queen to be depicted in contemporary artwork in a manuscript that survives to this day. The New Minster Liber Vitae, a book created for Winchester's New Minster, a monastery founded by King Æthelred the Great, have included a beautiful illuminated image showing Emma and Cnut together, presenting a golden cross to an altar, with Christ above blessing their offering. The image is striking in several ways. Emma and Cnut are shown as equals, both crowned, both the same size, both making the offering together. They are not depicted in a hierarchical relationship with the king dominant and the queen subordinate, but rather as partners in their royal and religious duties. The image proclaimed Emma's status as a true queen, not merely the king's wife, but a ruler in her own right. This visual representation of queenly power was unprecedented in English history and showed just how prominent Emma had become. But Emma's rise to power and wealth came with complications and difficulties. She was deeply involved in church politics, perhaps more than was entirely proper or beneficial for her reputation. There are suggestions in the sources that Emma may have been involved in simony, the buying and selling of church offices. This was a common practice in the medieval church, though it was officially condemned as sinful. Wealthy and powerful people would pay bishops or kings to secure positions in the church for their relatives or supporters, or would themselves accept payments in exchange for using their influence to secure such positions. Emma apparently played a role in securing the position of Archbishop of Canterbury for a man named Stigand, who would later become highly controversial. Stigand was a capable administrator and a loyal supporter of Emma. but his appointment and his tenure as archbishop were marked by questions about his legitimacy. Later chroniclers would criticize him, and his irregular status would become a problem for the English Church. Emma's involvement in his appointment shows that she was willing to use her influence in church affairs to advance her interests and to reward her supporters, even when this might be problematic from a religious perspective. Emma also had to navigate the ongoing tensions created by Cnut's complicated family situation. Ælfgifu of Northampton, Cnut's first wife, remained influential and powerful. She had her own properties, her own household, her own supporters, and she had her sons, particularly Harold Harefoot, who were potential heirs to Cnut's throne, despite the marriage agreement that supposedly gave precedence to Emma's children. The relationship between Emma and Ælfgifu must have been tense and difficult. They were rivals, competing for influence over Cnut, competing for status and recognition, competing to secure the succession for their respective sons. The fact that medieval sources rarely mention them together suggests that they avoided each other when possible, each maintaining her own sphere of influence, each trying to position her son as the rightful heir. In the late 1020s, when Cnut conquered Norway, adding it to his realm and making Emma Queen of Norway, as well as England and Denmark, giving her the unprecedented status of Queen of three kingdoms simultaneously, Cnut sent Ælfgifu and her son Svein to rule Norway as his regents. This was an extraordinary elevation of Ælfgifu's status. She was effectively made Queen of Norway, ruling a kingdom in Cnut's name, exercising royal authority. For Emma, seeing her rival placed in such an important position must have been galling. A reminder that despite the marriage agreement, despite her own children's supposed precedence, Ælfgifu and her sons remained significant players in the politics of Cnut's realm. Cnut's realm at its height in the late 1020s and early 1030s was truly impressive, sometimes called the North Sea Empire by modern historians, though the term is somewhat anachronistic, since Cnut himself never used such a title. He ruled England, Denmark, Norway, and had influence over parts of Sweden. His power stretched from the North Sea to the Baltic Sea, from the Norwegian fjords to the English Channel. He controlled vital trade routes, received tribute from multiple kingdoms, commanded large armies and fleets. He was one of the most powerful rulers in all of Christian Europe. This vast realm required constant attention and frequent travel. Cnut could not simply sit in England and rule his empire from there. He had to visit Denmark regularly to maintain his authority there, to deal with threats from Sweden, to ensure that Danish nobles remained loyal. He had to travel to Norway to assert his control over that troubled and rebellious kingdom. He had to move between his different realms frequently, showing himself to his subjects, holding courts, making judgments, leading military campaigns when necessary. This frequent absence of the king meant that Emma often acted as regent in England, governing the kingdom while Cnut was away. This was an enormous responsibility, one that few queens had been trusted with in English history. It showed the confidence Cnut had in Emma's abilities and judgment, and it gave Emma practical experience in governance that few women of her time could match. When Cnut was in Denmark or Norway, it was Emma who presided over the royal council in England, Emma who made administrative decisions, Emma who dealt with petitions and problems, Emma who kept the machinery of government running smoothly. Cnut's power and ambitions reached their zenith in 1027, when he travelled to Rome to attend the coronation of Conrad II as Holy Roman Emperor. This was an extraordinary journey, a triumph of diplomacy and prestige. Cnut travelled with a large entourage, making his way across Europe to the Holy City, demonstrating to all of Christendom that he was no mere Viking raider, but a great Christian king deserving of respect and honour. In Rome, Cnut was received with honour by Pope John XIX himself, and he attended the imperial coronation ceremony, witnessing Conrad's elevation to the highest secular office in Christendom. He negotiated with the Pope, securing reduced tolls for English pilgrims travelling to Rome, obtaining favourable terms for English merchants trading in Europe. He met with other European rulers who had come to Rome for the coronation, establishing diplomatic relationships, arranging marriages, building alliances. Cnut wrote a letter from Rome to the people of England, a document that survives in historical records and that is remarkable for its tone and content. In it, he presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as an English king concerned for his English subjects. He promised to rule justly, to maintain peace, to protect the church. He described his diplomatic achievements, how the concessions he had won from the Pope and from other rulers that would benefit English merchants and pilgrims. He positioned himself as a successful Christian monarch who had brought honour to England on the European stage. For Emma, Cnut's journey to Rome and his success there must have been gratifying. She was married to one of the most powerful and successful kings in Europe. Her status as his queen meant that she too enjoyed reflected glory and prestige. European rulers who wanted to establish relationships with Cnut might also need to cultivate Emma's favour. Her position was more secure and more prominent than it had ever been during her first marriage. Yet even at the height of their power, there were shadows over Emma and Cnut's success. The rule of Ælfgifu and Svein in Norway was proving deeply problematic. The Norwegian people resented their Danish overlords, resented the heavy taxation and harsh governance that Ælfgifu and Svein imposed. Norway had a strong tradition of independence, a fierce pride in its own identity, and many Norwegians had never truly accepted Cnut's conquest of their kingdom. By the early 1030s, Norway was in revolt against Danish rule. A Norwegian nobleman named Olaf Haraldsson, who had been driven from Norway by Cnut's initial conquest, returned from exile and gathered an army of Norwegian supporters. There was fighting between Olaf's forces and those loyal to Cnut. The situation was chaotic and violent, threatening to spiral completely out of Cnut's control. In 1030, at the Battle of Stiklestad, Olaf was defeated and killed by his own Norwegian countrymen, who still supported Danish rule. His death might have seemed like a victory for Cnut, a validation of his control over Norway. But in death, Olaf became a martyr and eventually a saint. Stories circulated about miracles at his tomb, about his sanctity and holiness. Norwegian identity began to coalesce around the memory of this fallen king, and opposition to Danish rule actually intensified rather than diminishing. Svein, Ælfgifu's son, who had been ruling Norway as Cnut's regent, died around 1035, probably while trying to maintain control over the increasingly rebellious kingdom. His death was a blow to his mother, Ælfgifu, and it removed one of the potential claimants to Cnut's throne. But it also meant that Norway was effectively lost to Cnut's empire. Within a few years, Norway would fully break away from Danish control, and Cnut's great North Sea empire would prove less durable than it had seemed at its height. On the 12th of November, 1035, at Shaftesbury in Dorset, Cnut died. He was probably only about 40 years old, and his death was sudden and unexpected. Medieval sources do not tell us the cause of his death. Perhaps illness, perhaps infection from an injury, perhaps simply a sudden stroke or heart attack. Whatever the cause, the great king who had built an empire, who had ruled with such apparent success for nearly 2 decades, was gone, and his death would plunge England once again into political chaos. For Emma, Cnut's death on that November day in 1035 was another moment of crisis, perhaps even more dangerous and uncertain. than the death of her first husband Æthelred had been 19 years earlier. She was now about 50 or 51 years old, twice widowed, and her position was once again in grave jeopardy. But this time, she had resources and experience that she had lacked in 1016. She had ruled as queen for nearly 2 decades under Cnut. She had served as regent, had managed kingdoms in the king's absence, had built networks of supporters and allies. She was wealthy, powerful, and politically sophisticated. And most importantly, she had a son who was positioned to inherit the throne. Æthelred, her son with Cnut, who was about 17 or 18 years old. The problem was that Æthelred was not in England when his father died. He was in Denmark, where he had been serving as his father's deputy and learning to rule the Danish kingdom. Cnut had sent Æthelred to Denmark years earlier, wanting his designated heir to understand both of the kingdoms he would one day rule. Æthelred had been managing Danish affairs, dealing with threats from Norway and Sweden, learning statecraft and governance under the tutelage of experienced Danish nobles. But now, with Cnut dead and the English throne vacant, Æthelred's absence from England was a serious problem. In medieval politics, the succession often went to whoever could seize power most quickly. Physical presence mattered enormously. A claimant who was in the capital, who could be crowned promptly, who could secure the royal treasury and the support of key nobles before rivals could organize, had an enormous advantage over someone who was far away and who would take weeks or months to arrive. And Æthelred judged that he could not immediately travel to England, and Denmark was facing military threats. Swedish and Norwegian forces were pressing on Danish borders, taking advantage of Cnut's death to try to seize Danish territory or to assert their own independence. If Æthelred left Denmark now, he might lose that kingdom entirely. He needed to secure Denmark first, to stabilize the situation there, to ensure that his Danish kingdom was safe before he could claim his English inheritance. This was probably a sound strategic judgment from Æthelred's perspective. Denmark was his by clear hereditary right. He was Cnut's son by Emma, and there was no serious rival claimant to the Danish throne. If he could secure Denmark, he would at least have one kingdom even if there were problems with the English succession. And he presumably thought that he could count on his mother Emma to hold England for him until he could arrive. But Æthelred's delay in coming to England created a political vacuum that his rivals were eager to fill. And the most prominent of these rivals was Harold Harefoot, Cnut's son by Æthelred of Northampton, Emma's longtime rival and competitor. Harold was actually in England when Cnut died, giving him an enormous advantage. He was probably in his late teens or early 20s, old enough to rule, and he had supporters particularly in the northern parts of England, where Danish settlement was strong and where Æthelred had cultivated influence over the years. Harold moved quickly to claim the throne. He had the support of many powerful nobles, particularly those in the north. He argued that he was Cnut's son, and that he was in England and ready to rule, that England could not afford to wait indefinitely for Æthelred to arrive from Denmark. Some of his supporters may have also argued that as Cnut's older son, Harold had a better claim than his younger half-brother Æthelred, regardless of what the marriage agreement between Cnut and Emma had said. Emma fought desperately against Harold's claim. She argued that Æthelred was the legitimate heir, that Cnut had designated him as successor, that the marriage agreement when she wed Cnut had stipulated that her sons would take precedence over Cnut's sons from his relationship with Æthelred. She called upon her own supporters, the nobles and churchmen, who were loyal to her, who had benefited from her patronage over the years, who remembered that she was the crowned and anointed Queen of England. And Emma had particular support in Wessex, which had always been the heartland of English royal power, the region from which the kings of England had originally come before the Danish conquest. Wessex had been Edmund Ironside's power base before his death, and many nobles there still remembered the English royal line and were uncomfortable with completely Danish rule. For these nobles, Cnut represented a compromise. He was Cnut's son and thus Danish, but he was also Emma's son and thus connected to the Norman and English royal traditions. For a time, there was an uneasy compromise, a partition of England that echoed the earlier partition between Edmund Ironside and Cnut. Harold was recognised as king, or at least as regent, in the northern parts of England, while Emma held Wessex for Cnut. Emma established herself in Winchester, and the city that had been so central to her life for more than 30 years, the place she seemed to consider most truly her home. She controlled the royal treasury at Winchester, the vast wealth in gold and silver that Cnut had accumulated over his reign. With this wealth, she could pay soldiers, reward supporters, sustain her political position, while waiting for her son to arrive from Denmark. But as months turned into years and Cnut still did not come from Denmark, Emma's position gradually weakened while Harold's strengthened. More and more English nobles began to accept Harold as their king, judging that Cnut either could not or would not come to claim his inheritance. The practical realities of politics favoured Harold. He was present, he was actively governing, he was making decisions and dispensing patronage, and while Cnut was an absent figure whose promised arrival kept being delayed. Some nobles probably preferred Harold for other reasons as well. He was fully Danish, the son of a Danish mother, from an important English family, someone who had grown up in England and understood English politics. Cnut, in contrast, had been raised partly in England but had spent recent years in Denmark, might be more oriented toward Danish rather than English interests, was the son of a Norman mother who might bring Norman influence into English governance. For nobles who were wary of foreign influence or who valued Danish traditions, Harold might have seemed preferable to Cnut. By 1036 or 1037, Harold's position had become strong enough that he was being generally recognised as King of England, and not merely as regent or as a claimant, but as the actual king. Emma's position had become untenable. She still held Winchester and the treasury, still maintained that Cnut was the rightful heir, but the political reality was turning against her. She could not hold out indefinitely against a king who was supported by most of the English nobility and who controlled most of the kingdom. It was during this difficult and dangerous period that the worst tragedy of Emma's life occurred, a tragedy that would haunt her for the rest of her days and that would permanently damage her relationship with one of her surviving sons. Her sons from her first marriage to Æthelred, Edward and Alfred, who had been living in Normandy for 20 years, returned to England, and the exact circumstances of their return are disputed by historians and were contested even in medieval sources, with different accounts giving very different versions of what happened and why. Some sources suggest that Emma herself sent for her sons, calling them back to England to help her in her struggle against Harold Harefoot. This version implies that Emma was trying to use Edward and Alfred as a counter to Harold, perhaps hoping that one of them might be accepted as king if Cnut could not claim the throne. Other sources suggest that Edward and Alfred came to England on their own initiative, perhaps hoping to reclaim their father's throne, perhaps simply wanting to see their mother after 2 decades of separation, and perhaps responding to reports that England was in political chaos and that opportunities might exist for ambitious princes. Some Norman sources claim that they tried to launch separate expeditions, with Edward attempting one landing and Alfred attempting another. According to these Norman accounts, Edward sailed from Normandy and landed somewhere in southern England, probably in Hampshire or Sussex. There was fighting between Edward's forces and local English defenders. Edward may have won this battle or at least fought it to a draw. But he then decided that the situation was too dangerous, that he lacked sufficient support to mount a serious bid for the throne. He withdrew to Normandy, taking with him plunder from his raid, but making no lasting impact on the English succession crisis. Alfred, according to these accounts, made a separate attempt to reach England, perhaps landing in Kent or Sussex. His goal was apparently to reach his mother Emma in Winchester, to join her in holding Wessex for Harthacnut, or perhaps simply to visit her after so many years of separation. Alfred was probably approaching 30 years old by this point, a grown man who had spent most of his life in exile in Normandy, far from his mother and from the English kingdom that was his birthright. As Alfred travelled toward Winchester, he was met by Earl Godwin of Wessex, one of the most powerful nobles in England. Godwin was a complex and controversial figure who had risen to power under Cnut, and who now had to navigate the dangerous politics of the succession crisis. He was Earl of Wessex, which meant he was nominally Emma's ally. Wessex was the region that Emma held for Harthacnut, and as Earl of Wessex, Godwin should have been supporting Emma's cause. But Godwin may have been hedging his bets, trying to maintain good relations with Harold Harefoot as well as with Emma, positioning himself to survive and prosper regardless of who ultimately won the throne. Or he may have decided that Harold's cause was more likely to succeed, and that he needed to demonstrate his loyalty to the emerging king. Or perhaps he was acting under direct orders from Harold to eliminate this potential threat to Harold's rule. Whatever Godwin's motivations, he received Alfred with apparent honour and hospitality. He feasted the young prince and his followers, provided them with lodgings, gave every appearance of welcoming them and offering them protection. Alfred, trusting in this hospitality, perhaps believing that Godwin was his mother's ally and therefore his own ally, relaxed his guard. Then, in the night or early morning, disaster struck. The sources give different versions of what exactly happened, but the outcome was always the same. Alfred and his men were attacked. Some accounts say that Godwin's own men carried out the attack. Other accounts say that Harold Harefoot's soldiers arrived and Godwin stood aside, allowing them to seize Alfred. Still other versions suggest that Godwin betrayed Alfred and handed him over to Harold's forces. Alfred's followers were scattered, captured, or killed. Some were slaughtered on the spot. Others were rounded up and sold into slavery, sent to distant lands where they would never see England or their homes again. Some may have escaped the initial violence but were hunted down in the following days. It was a catastrophe for Alfred's small force, complete and total defeat. And for Alfred himself, the worst was yet to come. He was seized and taken to the Abbey at Ely, a monastery in the marshy fens of eastern England, far from Winchester, far from his mother, far from any help that might have saved him. At Ely, probably acting under orders from Harold Harefoot, Alfred was subjected to one of the most brutal and horrific punishments of the medieval period. He was blinded. Blinding in the medieval world was not a surgical procedure done with medical care and precision. It was a form of torture and mutilation, deliberately designed to be horrifically painful and to render the victim permanently disabled. In Alfred's case, according to the sources, and the blinding was done by pressing a red-hot iron poker into his eyes, burning and destroying them, causing unimaginable agony. The purpose of blinding went beyond simply causing suffering, though it certainly did that. In medieval political and religious thinking, a king needed to be physically whole and perfect. A man who was blind, who lacked his eyes, who had been mutilated, was considered unfit to rule. By blinding Alfred, Harold was ensuring that even if Alfred survived, he could never be king, could never be a threat to Harold's throne. But Alfred did not survive for long. The blinding was so brutal, the trauma so severe, that he died from his wounds, probably within a few days. Infection was almost inevitable with such injuries, and without modern medical care, death was the most likely outcome. Alfred was buried at Ely Abbey, far from the royal tombs at Winchester, where his father and other English kings were buried, dead at about 30 years of age, having suffered horribly in his final days. For Emma, the news of Alfred's death must have been absolutely devastating. This was her son, her child, a boy she had protected by sending him to safety in Normandy when he was just a small child, now dead after terrible suffering, tortured and murdered for political reasons, denied even the dignity of an honourable death. Emma had already lost her daughter Gogefu at some point in these years. The sources do not record when or how Gogefu died, but she disappears from the historical record by this time, suggesting that she, too, was dead. Now Alfred was gone as well, leaving only Edward and Æthelred surviving of Emma's 4 children. And the circumstances of Alfred's death were deeply troubling for Emma's political position. Where was Emma when her son was being tortured and killed? Why had she not protected him? If she had indeed called him back to England, as some sources suggested, then she bore some responsibility for bringing him into danger. If she had not called him, but knew he was coming, why had she not warned him or provided him with better protection? These questions must have tormented Emma, and they certainly damaged her reputation and political standing. The Encomium Emmae Reginae, the book that Emma would commission a few years later, worked hard to absolve Emma of any blame for Alfred's death. The Encomium placed full responsibility on Harold Harefoot, presenting him as the villain who ordered Alfred's murder. It said almost nothing about Godwin's role, which is striking given that many people, including Emma's other son Edward, believed that Godwin had betrayed Alfred. But by the time the Encomium was written, Godwin had become enormously powerful and was closely allied with Edward, so criticizing him would have been politically dangerous for Emma. The loss of Alfred, combined with her weakening political position, made Emma's situation in England impossible. By 1037, Harold was being universally recognized as King of England. Emma could no longer hold Winchester against him, could no longer maintain the fiction that she was holding Wessex for Æthelred. She had to accept reality. She had lost this succession struggle, and staying in England would likely result in her imprisonment or worse. Emma fled England for the second time in her life, and going into exile just as she had done during the reign of Sweyn Forkbeard more than 20 years earlier. But this time, she did not go to Normandy, her original homeland. Instead, she went to Flanders, to the court of Count Baldwin V in Bruges. Baldwin was married to Emma's stepdaughter Adela, one of Cnut's daughters from his first wife Elfgifu, which gave Emma a family connection there. Baldwin offered her refuge, giving her a place at his court, providing her with safety and resources. In Bruges, Emma waited and plotted, corresponding with Æthelred, urging him to come to England and claim his throne, hoping that somehow the situation might yet be reversed. And eventually, Æthelred did join his mother in Bruges. After years of fighting to secure Denmark, Æthelred finally felt able to leave, and he came to Flanders to meet with Emma and to plan an invasion of England. Together, Emma and Æthelred began assembling a fleet and an army. They gathered ships, recruited warriors, collected supplies, preparing for an invasion that would drive Harold Harefoot from the English throne and place Æthelred in his rightful position as king. The preparations took months, and during this time, Emma and her son must have had many conversations about what had happened, about Harold's usurpation, about Alfred's death, about the future of their family and their kingdoms. But before Æthelred could launch his invasion, the problem solved itself in an unexpected way. On the 17th of March, 1040, Harold Harefoot died in England, He had ruled England for about 3 or 4 years, and depending on how one counts his initial period as regent, before he was fully recognized as king. He was probably only in his early to mid-20s. The cause of his death is not recorded in the surviving sources, though some hint at illness. Some later writers would suggest that his death was divine punishment for Alfred's murder, God striking down the guilty king. But more prosaic explanations are possible. Disease, infection, some sudden illness that struck a young man in what should have been his prime. Harold's death removed the obstacle to Harthacnut's succession. With Harold gone, there was no serious rival claimant to the English throne. Harthacnut was Knut's son by his marriage to Emma, the designated heir, and the man who should have inherited the throne 5 years earlier, if not for political circumstances and his own absence in Denmark. English nobles sent messages to Flanders inviting Harthacnut to come to England and claim his inheritance. Emma and Harthacnut crossed to England together in June of 1040, arriving with a fleet of 62 warships, an impressive display of military might. The large fleet was partly a precaution. Harthacnut could not be sure what reception he would receive in England, and he wanted to be prepared for resistance. But it was also a statement of power, a demonstration to English nobles that their new king commanded substantial resources and should be respected. In the event, Harthacnut's accession was peaceful. He was invited to take the throne rather than having to fight for it, and he was crowned as King of England without serious opposition. At last, after 5 years of struggle and exile and tragedy, Emma's son by Cnut had inherited the English throne as had been intended all along. One of Harthacnut's first acts as king was a demonstration of his rage at Harold Harefoot and his determination to exact revenge, even on the dead. He had Harold's body exhumed from its place of honour at Westminster Abbey, where Harold had been buried with the full ceremonies due to a king. The corpse, which would have been in some stage of decomposition depending on how long Harold had been dead, was brought up from its tomb. Then, in a shocking display that must have startled and disturbed even those who hated Harold, Harthacnut had the corpse publicly beheaded, and this desecration of a dead body was deeply offensive by medieval standards, a violation of basic decency and Christian practice. The headless corpse was then thrown into a sewer or ditch, left lying in filth like the body of a criminal rather than a king. Later, some Londoners, perhaps moved by pity or by a sense that even a hated king deserved better than this, retrieved Harold's body from where it had been discarded. They gave it a more decent burial in a churchyard, though not with the honours that would normally accompany a royal burial. The desecration of Harold's corpse showed the depth of Harthacnut's anger. Anger over Harold's usurpation of the throne that should have been Harthacnut's. Anger over the years of struggle and exile. Perhaps anger over Alfred's murder if Harthacnut blamed Harold for his half-brother's death. For Emma, Harthacnut's accession meant that she was restored to her former position of power and influence. She was once again Queen Mother, no longer in exile, but rather one of the most important figures in the English kingdom. Her properties were returned to her. Her status was recognized and honored. She and Harthacnut ruled together, and she must have felt that after years of struggle and loss, she had finally achieved security for herself and her family. But Harthacnut's reign would not be a happy one, and it would not last long. Almost immediately, Harthacnut became unpopular with his English subjects for several reasons. First, he levied crushing taxes to pay off the crews of his fleet. He demanded a geld, tax, of over £21,000, and then an enormous sum that fell heavily on English landowners and peasants who were already exhausted by years of warfare and instability. To put this sum in perspective, it was probably more than the normal annual revenue of the entire English kingdom. Collecting it required aggressive tax collectors going through the country, demanding payments, seizing property from those who could not pay. The taxation made Æthelred deeply unpopular almost immediately upon his accession. Second, Æthelred was harsh and unforgiving in his governance. He dealt severely with those who had opposed him or who had supported Harold Harefoot. He showed little mercy and less wisdom in handling the complex political situations he inherited. He seemed more interested in punishing his enemies than in building a broad base of support. Third, Æthelred was visibly and primarily Danish rather than English. He had been raised mostly in Denmark, spoke Danish as his first language, brought Danish advisors with him, seemed more oriented toward Danish customs and interests than toward English ones. For English nobles who had hoped that Emma's influence might make Æthelred more English in his outlook, this must have been disappointing. There was even an incident in Worcester where 2 of Ætheldred's tax collectors were murdered by angry citizens who resented the heavy taxation. Ætheldred's response was savage. He sent an army to Worcester with orders to burn the city and kill its inhabitants. The city was ravaged, buildings burned, people killed or driven out as refugees, and this brutal response further damaged Ætheldred's reputation and increased English hatred of their Danish king. Emma, however, was restored to her former wealth and status. She was once again the Queen Mother, wealthy, influential and respected. She and Æthelred ruled together, appearing on charters, making decisions jointly. She must have felt that finally, after so many years of struggle, she had achieved her goals. Her son was king, she was secure in her position, and the future seemed assured. But that future was about to be disrupted again by events that Emma could not control. Emma was also concerned about her other surviving son, Edward, who was still in Normandy. Edward had watched from across the channel as his half-brother Æthelred took the English throne. As Emma was restored to power, as the dynasty established itself in England. What was Edward's position in all of this? He was Emma's son by her first marriage to Æthelred, making him technically a prince of the old English royal line. But Æthelred was king, and Æthelred had no particular obligation to Edward. In 1041, remarkably, Æthelred invited his half-brother Edward to return to England from his long exile. The sources suggest that Edward was not just invited back, but was actually sworn in as heir to the throne, recognized as the future King of England who would succeed Æthelred. The Encomium Emmae Reginae strongly implies this, describing Edward and Æthelred ruling together in harmony under Emma's guidance. Why did Æthelred do this? Several explanations are possible. Perhaps Emma urged him to do it, wanting to ensure that both of her surviving sons had security and status, wanting to heal the breach between her 2 families, wanting to ensure that regardless of what happened, one of her sons would be king. Perhaps Æthelred was concerned about the succession. He was unmarried and had no children, and if he died unexpectedly without an heir, England might be thrown into civil war again. By designating Edward as his successor, Æthelred was providing for an orderly succession. Or perhaps there were health concerns about Æthelred even then. Perhaps he was already ill, already aware that he might not live long, and wanted to ensure that the succession was settled before he died. Whatever the reason, Edward returned to England in 1041, and for a brief time, Emma had both of her surviving sons with her, one as king and one as heir, ruling England together. But this arrangement lasted less than a year. On the 8th of June, 1042, at a wedding feast at Lambeth, Æthelred suddenly collapsed. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he was drinking and making merry at the feast when he suddenly fell down and died almost immediately. Modern scholars speculate that he probably suffered a stroke or a heart attack, though some medieval sources dramatically claimed he died while drinking. perhaps implying excessive consumption of alcohol. Æthelred was only about 24 years old, in what should have been his prime. He had ruled England for barely 2 years, Denmark for 7. He had accomplished little as king, had made himself unpopular with his subjects, had failed to establish himself as an effective ruler, and now he was dead, leaving England to his half-brother Edward. For Emma, Ætheldred's death was another terrible loss. She had now lost 3 of her 4 children. Her daughter Godgifu had died at some unknown date. Alfred had been tortured and murdered. And now Æthelred, her son by Cnut, the child in whom she had placed so many hopes, was dead. Only Edward remained of her 4 children, and her relationship with Edward was troubled and distant at best. Emma must have grieved for Æthelred, mourned the loss of yet another child, felt the pain that any mother feels when burying a son, but she also must have felt a strange relief mixed with her grief. At least Edward had survived. At least one of her children would live to rule England. At least the succession would pass peacefully to her remaining son, rather than plunging England into yet another succession crisis. With Ætheldred's death, Edward became King of England. He was crowned in April of 1043, finally claiming the throne that had seemed so far from his grasp when he was exiled to Normandy as a teenager, more than 25 years earlier. Edward was probably about 40 years old by this point, middle-aged by medieval standards, shaped by decades of exile and by the complex politics of the Norman court where he had grown up. For Emma, Edward's accession might have seemed like the culmination of all her struggles, the final achievement of her life's work. She had been married to 2 kings and was now the mother of a 3rd. Her son sat on the English throne. Her position seemed secure, but the reality would prove far more complicated and far less happy than she might have hoped. Edward had grown up in Normandy, away from his mother, shaped by Norman culture and Norman advisors. He had not seen Emma for most of his life. She had sent him away when he was about 13 years old in 1017, and except for his brief return to England in 1041, he had spent 24 years in exile. Their relationship, which might never have been particularly close given the circumstances of Edward's childhood, had become distant and strained over the years of separation. Moreover, Edward blamed Emma, at least in part, for the death of his brother Alfred. He believed that she had not done enough to protect Alfred, or that she had been complicit in some way in bringing Alfred back to England where he was murdered. Whether this belief was fair or not, whether Emma could have done anything to prevent Alfred's death, the fact was that Edward held his mother responsible for his brother's terrible fate. The relationship between mother and son was further complicated by the fact that Emma had sent Edward into exile to protect him, but in doing so had separated them for most of his life. Edward had grown up without his mother, raised by Norman nobles, educated by Norman clergy, shaped by Norman rather than English culture. He was in many ways more Norman than English by the time he became king, and his loyalties and attachments were to the Norman court that had raised him, rather than to the English mother he barely knew. In late 1043, only months after his coronation, Edward took dramatic and shocking action against his mother. He rode to Winchester, and accompanied by 3 of the most powerful nobles in England, Earls Leofric, Godwin, and Siward. These were men who commanded great armies, who controlled large portions of England, whose support was essential for any king. Together, they confronted Emma at Winchester. Edward accused his mother of treason, though the exact nature of the accusations is not entirely clear from the surviving sources. He stripped her of her lands, her treasures, and her wealth. Emma, who had been one of the richest women in Europe, who had controlled extensive estates throughout England, who had accumulated treasures over decades, was suddenly reduced to dependence on her son's charity. All her property was confiscated, taken by the king, redistributed, or kept in royal hands. This was an extraordinary and shocking act. For a king to confiscate his own mother's property, to accuse her of treason, to treat her not as an honoured queen mother but as a criminal, this was almost unprecedented. What had Emma done to deserve such treatment? What were these accusations of treason? The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the main sources for this period, offers a cryptic explanation. It says that Edward did this because she had been too tight-fisted with him, suggesting that Emma had not been generous enough in supporting her son. This seems like a rather minor complaint to justify such harsh treatment. If Edward simply wanted more financial support from his mother, surely there were less drastic ways to obtain it than confiscating all her property. More likely, the confiscation was politically motivated, and Emma had been the centre of a faction that supported Danish interest during Cnut's reign and Æthelred's brief rule. She had been married to Cnut, she had promoted Æthelred, and many of her supporters had been Danes or English nobles with Danish connections. Edward, raised in Normandy and supported by Norman advisors, may have wanted to break the power of this Danish faction. By confiscating Emma's wealth, he was simultaneously weakening her political power and sending a message to her supporters that the Danish era was over. There may also have been lingering resentment about Alfred's death. Edward may have believed that Emma bore some responsibility for what had happened, that she had not protected his brother adequately, that she had made choices that led to Alfred's terrible fate. Punishing Emma by confiscating her property might have been Edward's way of expressing his anger and blame. Whatever the exact reasons, Emma found herself suddenly powerless and impoverished, dependent on her son's grudging charity for her very survival. The woman who had been queen of 3 kingdoms, who had ruled alongside kings, who had commanded vast wealth and extensive properties, was reduced to living on whatever allowance Edward chose to give her. It must have been a humiliating and bitter experience. But Edward's harsh treatment of his mother did not last long. By 1044, possibly as early as late 1043, mother and son were reconciled, or at least partially so. Emma's lands were restored to her, though perhaps not all of them, or not immediately. She was allowed to return to court, to witness royal charters again, and to resume at least some of her former status and influence. What brought about this reconciliation? Perhaps other nobles intervened, arguing that treating the Queen Mother so harshly was inappropriate and politically unwise. Perhaps Emma apologized, or made some concessions that satisfied Edward. Perhaps Edward himself realized that he had gone too far, that punishing his mother so severely was damaging his own reputation. Whatever the reason, the confiscation was reversed, and Emma was restored to at least some of her former position, though the relationship between mother and son probably never fully recovered from this breach. It was probably during this period, after her reconciliation with Edward, but while the memory of her fall from power was still fresh, that Emma commissioned the Encomium Emmae Reginae, the famous book that was written in her praise and that has been so important for understanding her life and times. The Encomium was written by a Flemish monk, probably from the monastery of Saint-Bertin at Saint-Omer in Flanders. At Emma's specific request and expense, Emma would have paid the author, provided him with information about events, guided the narrative to serve her purposes. The resulting work was therefore not an objective history, but rather a carefully crafted piece of political propaganda, designed to present Emma in the most favourable possible light, and to advance her political interests. The Encomium is divided into 3 books, each focusing on different aspects of the story. The first book deals with Sweyn Forkbeard, Cnut's father, and his conquest of England in 1013, and this section establishes the Danish claim to England and presents Swine as a legitimate conqueror who won England through strength and courage. The second book focuses on Cnut, describing his reconquest of England after his father's death, his marriage to Emma, and his reign as king. This is the longest section of the Encomium and the most important from Emma's perspective. It presents Cnut as a great king and Emma as his honoured queen and partner. Significantly, it says almost nothing about Emma's first marriage to Æthelred. He is referred to only as a certain Prince of London, without even being named as king. The Encomium implies, through clever wording, that Emma's sons, Edward and Alfred, were actually her sons by Cnut, obscuring the fact that they were from her earlier marriage. The third book covers events after Cnut's death, the succession crisis, Harold Harefoot's usurpation, Emma's exile, Harthacnut's return, and Edward's accession. This section places full blame for Alfred's death on Harold Harefoot, protecting Earl Godwin, who by the time the Encomium was written had become enormously powerful and was Edward's father-in-law. The third book also emphasizes Emma's role as the wise mother, guiding her two sons Edward and Harthacnut, presenting them as ruling together in harmony under her guidance. The Encomium also includes a remarkable illuminated image that appears at the beginning of the manuscript. This image shows Emma seated on her throne, crowned and regal, receiving the Encomium from its author, who kneels before her presenting the book. Standing behind Emma are her two sons, Harthacnut and Edward, also crowned. The image presents Emma as the central figure, the focus of the composition, with even her royal sons in subordinate positions. It is a striking statement of queenly power and authority. This image is historically significant as the first known contemporary portrait of a crowned English queen that survives to this day. Earlier queens may have been depicted in artwork that has since been lost, but Emma's portrait in the Encomium is the earliest that we can still see. It shows how Emma wanted to be remembered as a powerful queen, mother of kings, central to English politics, deserving of honour and respect. The Encomium was Emma's attempt to control her own narrative, to shape how she would be remembered by posterity, to defend herself against critics, and to advance her interests. It is a fascinating document that tells us much about Emma's political sophistication and her understanding of the importance of historical memory. She knew that how she was remembered would matter, would affect her reputation and legacy, would influence how future generations understood the events of her time. But the Encomium was not widely circulated and did not have the immediate impact Emma might have hoped for. It was copied a few times, but it was not as influential as some other historical works of the period. And in the centuries after Emma's death, she was largely forgotten, remembered, if at all, only as a footnote in the stories of her more famous husbands and sons. There is one more famous story associated with Emma, though it almost certainly is not historically true and probably did not happen. And this is the legend of the ordeal by fire, a dramatic tale that became attached to Emma's memory in later centuries. According to this legend, which first appears in sources written in the 13th century, about 200 years after Emma's death, Emma was accused during Edward's reign of having an inappropriate sexual relationship with Ælfwine, the Bishop of Winchester. This was a serious accusation. Adultery was always scandalous, but a sexual relationship between a queen and a bishop would have been even more shocking, combining political scandal with religious impropriety. To prove her innocence, according to the legend, Emma underwent an ordeal by fire. Ordeals were a medieval method of determining guilt or innocence, based on the belief that God would intervene to protect innocent people who underwent them. In Emma's ordeal are 9 red-hot ploughshares, the metal blades that are part of a plough, heated until they glowed red. were laid out on the floor of Winchester Cathedral. Emma, according to the story, was plainly dressed in simple garments, with her feet and lower legs bare. She was blindfolded, so that she could not see where she was stepping. Guided by bishops, she walked across the red-hot ploughshares, but through divine intervention, the legend credits Saint Swithin, the patron saint of Winchester. Emma felt no pain and suffered no injury. When she reached the end of the ordeal, she supposedly asked, "When shall we come to the ploughshares?" not even realizing that she had already walked across them. This miraculous proof of her innocence supposedly caused King Edward to beg his mother's forgiveness, to restore all her confiscated property, and to reconcile with her completely. As part of her gratitude for this miracle, Emma is said to have given several manors to the Church of St. Swithin at Winchester, including the manor of South Hayling. It is a dramatic and memorable story, the kind of tale that makes for good storytelling with its elements of accusation, trial, miracle, and reconciliation. Over the centuries, it was told and retold, illustrated in paintings and stained glass, described in chronicles and histories. The legend became perhaps the best-known story about Emma, more familiar to later generations than the actual historical events of her life. But modern historians are virtually certain that the ordeal never actually happened, that it is a legend that grew up around Emma's memory long after her death. Several pieces of evidence support this conclusion. First, the story does not appear in any contemporary sources. The Encomium Emmae Reginae, written during Emma's lifetime, never mentions any such ordeal. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which records the confiscation of Emma's property in 1043, and which would surely have mentioned such a dramatic event, says nothing about an ordeal. The story only appears in sources written in the 13th century, long after everyone who had known Emma was dead. Second, the details of the story are suspicious. Bishop Ælfwine of Winchester had been dead for several years by the time Edward supposedly accused Emma. Accusing someone of a sexual relationship with a dead person makes no sense. This chronological impossibility suggests that the story is fictional. Third, stories about miraculous ordeals were common in medieval literature and legend. They were the kind of tale that medieval people loved, stories that demonstrated God's intervention in human affairs, that vindicated the innocent and punished the guilty. Such tales often grew up around the memories of prominent figures, regardless of whether the events actually happened. More likely, the ordeal story is a legend that was created in the 13th century, perhaps inspired by the real confiscation of Emma's property by Edward and their subsequent reconciliation. Medieval storytellers, knowing that Emma had been accused by her son and had later been reconciled with him, may have invented the dramatic ordeal story as an explanation. The story served to portray Emma as completely innocent of any wrongdoing, vindicated by God himself, and it enhanced the prestige of Winchester Cathedral by associating it with a miracle. And whether the ordeal actually happened or not, Emma's final years were spent in relative peace. Her relationship with Edward seems to have stabilized after their initial conflicts, though it was probably never warm or close. In 1045, Edward married Edith, the daughter of Earl Godwin of Wessex. This marriage brought Godwin, the man many suspected of complicity in Alfred's death, even closer to the centre of power, making him the king's father-in-law. For Emma, seeing Godwin achieve such prominence must have been bitter. This was the man who had been travelling with Alfred when Alfred was captured and murdered. Many people, including Edward himself initially, believed that Godwin had betrayed Alfred. Yet here he was, more powerful than ever, his daughter married to the king, immune from punishment or serious criticism. Emma had to accept this reality, had to live at a court where the man she may have blamed for her son's death was honoured and influential. But Emma no longer had the power to change things. She was an old woman now, in her 60s, her active political career effectively over. She maintained her properties and her household. She continued her religious patronage, making gifts to churches and monasteries, ensuring that prayers would be said for her soul after her death. She attended court ceremonies when appropriate, witnessing charters, maintaining at least some presence in political life. But she was no longer the active, influential figure she had been during Cnut's reign, or even during Æthelred's brief rule. Emma lived to see her granddaughter Gunhilda, her daughter by Cnut, make a brilliant marriage to Henry, was son of Conrad II, the Holy Roman Emperor. This match demonstrated that even in her old age, Emma's family was connected to the highest levels of European aristocracy. The descendants of Emma and Cnut had become part of the imperial family, an achievement that would have seemed impossible when Emma first arrived in England as a teenager bride more than 40 years earlier. Emma died on the 6th of March, 1052, at Winchester, the city she had loved, and that had been central to her life for 50 years. She was probably about 67 or 68 years old, an impressive age for the medieval period, when life expectancy was much shorter than today. She had outlived both of her husbands, had outlived 3 of her 4 children, had outlived numerous rivals and allies, as she had witnessed some of the most important events in English history: the Viking conquests, the Danish rule, the restoration of the English line under her son Edward. She was buried in the Old Minster at Winchester, alongside Cnut and Æthelred. This choice of burial place was significant and telling. She was not buried with her first husband Æthelred, who was buried elsewhere. Instead, she chose to be buried with her second husband Cnut, and with Æthelred, her son by Cnut. This suggests that Emma felt her identity and her legacy were more closely tied to her second marriage than to her first, that her years as Cnut's queen and as Æthelred's mother were the most important and meaningful of her life. The burial in the Old Minster should have been Emma's final resting place, a peaceful tomb where her remains could rest for eternity, while her soul enjoyed the rewards of heaven. But even in death, Emma would not find lasting peace. During the English Civil War in the 17th century, more than 600 years after Emma's death, parliamentary forces under Oliver Cromwell desecrated Winchester Cathedral. Soldiers broke into the royal tombs, scattering the bones they found there. Emma's remains, along with those of Cnut, Æthelred, and other English kings and queens buried at Winchester, were dug up and scattered across the cathedral floor. The soldiers may have been looking for treasure, or they may have been acting out of iconoclastic zeal against symbols of monarchy and Catholic tradition. Whatever their motivation, and they destroyed the integrity of the royal tombs and mixed the bones together indiscriminately. Later, after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, an attempt was made to gather the scattered bones and rebury them properly. But by then, it was impossible to tell which bones belonged to which person. The remains were mixed together and placed in mortuary chests that still sit atop the screens in Winchester Cathedral today. Emma's physical remains are there somewhere in those chests, mingled with the bones of her husbands and son and other royalty, but they can no longer be individually identified. Emma's legacy is complex and multifaceted, and her place in history has changed dramatically over the centuries since her death. In the years immediately following her death in 1052, Emma may have been remembered primarily as the mother of Edward the Confessor, who would eventually be canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. Edward's sanctity and his later reputation as a holy king might have reflected positively on his mother, presenting her as the woman who had given birth to and raised an English saint. But even this connection to Edward would soon be overshadowed by events that came just 14 years after Emma's death. In 1066, Emma's great-nephew William, Duke of Normandy, invaded England and conquered it, defeating and killing King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. This Norman conquest transformed England utterly, bringing French language and culture, Norman administrative practices, feudal land tenure, castle building, and a complete replacement of the English aristocracy with Norman nobles. Our William claimed the English throne based in part on his kinship with Edward the Confessor, who had died childless earlier in 1066. This kinship was through Emma. William was the grandson of Emma's brother Richard II, making William Edward's first cousin once removed. The Norman propagandists who justified William's conquest emphasized this family connection, arguing that Edward had promised the throne to William, and that Harold Godwinson was a usurper who had stolen William's rightful inheritance. The Norman conquest was tremendously significant, perhaps the most important event in English history since the Roman invasion more than 1,000 years earlier. It shaped English language, law, government, culture, and society in ways that persist even today. And Emma, through her marriages and her children, had created the family connections that made the Norman conquest possible. But Emma's role in creating the conditions for the conquest was indirect and probably unintentional. She had not arranged her marriage to Æthelred with the intention that it would one day justify a Norman claim to the English throne. She had sent her sons to Normandy to protect them from danger, not to give them Norman sympathies that would later facilitate a Norman invasion. She had worked to advance her own interests and those of her children, not to prepare the way for Norman rule of England. Nevertheless, her marriages and her children created the family connections that William would exploit. Without Emma, without her marriage to Æthelred and her son Edward, and without the close ties between the English royal family and the Norman ducal family that Emma's life had created, William's claim to the English throne would have been much weaker or non-existent. Emma was, unintentionally, but undeniably, a crucial link in the chain of events that led to the Norman conquest. In the centuries after her death, Emma was largely forgotten by historians and chroniclers. Medieval chroniclers mentioned her in passing when discussing Æthelred or Cnut or Edward, but she was not typically presented as a major figure in her own right. The encomium that she had commissioned was copied a few times, but was not widely read or influential. The ordeal by fire legend became probably the best-known story about Emma, but even this legend kept her memory alive only in a distorted and fictional form. Why was Emma forgotten? And several factors probably contributed to her disappearance from historical memory. First, she was a woman in a world where history was almost always written about men. Medieval chroniclers focused on kings, on bishops, on male warriors and nobles. Women appeared in their chronicles mainly when they were wives, mothers, or daughters of important men, not as important figures in their own right. Second, Emma's story was complex and did not fit into simple narrative templates. She was not a romantic heroine. Her marriages were political arrangements, not love stories. She was not a villain, though some of her actions could be criticized. She was not evil or cruel in the ways that made for memorable villainy. She was not a saint or a martyr. Her life was not marked by religious devotion or suffering for faith. She was simply a politically astute woman who navigated the dangerous waters of medieval politics with skill and determination, and that did not make for the kind of dramatic story that chroniclers loved to tell. Third, Emma lived during a period of enormous political change and upheaval, and her own role was often overshadowed by the great events happening around her. The Viking invasions, the Danish conquest, the Norman conquest. These were the big stories that captured chroniclers' attention. Emma's patient political maneuvering, her accumulation of wealth and influence, her work to secure her children's futures. These were less dramatic and therefore less memorable to those writing history. It is only in modern times, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and that Emma has been rediscovered and her importance recognized. Several factors have contributed to this rediscovery. First, modern historians have become more interested in women's history, in recovering the stories of women who played important roles, but who were neglected by earlier male-dominated historiography. Emma is a perfect subject for this kind of historical recovery. Clearly important, clearly influential, but largely forgotten. Second, modern historians have developed new methods and approaches for studying medieval history, paying more attention to sources like charters and legal documents that reveal information about property ownership, wealth, and power structures. These sources make clear just how wealthy and powerful Emma was, how much property she controlled, how significant her patronage networks were. Earlier historians who focused primarily on military and political events might have overlooked this information, but modern social and economic historians recognize its importance. Third, the rediscovery and study of the Encomium Emmae Reginae in modern scholarship has provided historians with a rich source of information about Emma and has sparked new interest in her life. The Encomium was edited and published in modern scholarly editions, making it accessible to researchers. Historians have analyzed it carefully, teasing out what it reveals about Emma's political aims and self-presentation, about the events of the early 11th century, about queenship and power in the medieval world. Modern scholarship has also benefited from interdisciplinary approaches, bringing together insights from history, art history, literary studies, and gender studies, and other fields. This has allowed for more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of Emma's life and significance. She can be understood not just as a political figure, but also as a patron of the arts, as a religious devotee, as a woman navigating the constraints and opportunities of medieval gender roles, as a bridge between different cultures and kingdoms. So what can we say about Emma's legacy and significance? What did she accomplish during her long and remarkable life? First, Emma was a survivor. She lived through decades of warfare, through the fall of kingdoms and the rise of new dynasties, through personal tragedy and political defeat. She was exiled twice, widowed twice, lost 3 of her 4 children. Each time circumstances threatened to destroy her, she found a way to adapt, to endure, and to rebuild her position. This resilience is perhaps her most impressive quality, the ability to face terrible setbacks and to keep going, to keep working toward her goals despite seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Second, Emma demonstrated remarkable political acumen. Time after time, she made decisions that preserved her position and advanced her interests. When a nut offered marriage, she negotiated terms that protected her son's safety and her future children's succession rights. When Harold Harefoot threatened her power, she fought back, using her wealth and connections to resist his usurpation. When she commissioned the Encomium, she shaped her own historical narrative to serve her political purposes. She understood power, understood how to acquire it and maintain it, and use it effectively. Third, Emma was a link between different worlds. She was born in Normandy, lived most of her life in England, became Queen of Denmark and Norway. She connected the Norman world to the English to the Scandinavian to the broader European political system. Her marriages were attempts to bridge conflicts, to unite hostile parties, to create peace through family ties. That these attempts were not always successful does not diminish the significance of her role as a bridge between cultures. Fourth, Emma wielded real power in a world dominated by men. Through her wealth, her status as queen and queen mother, her patronage networks, her family connections, She achieved a level of power and influence that few women of her time could match. She participated in governance, acted as regent, made political decisions, and dispensed patronage. She was not merely a passive victim of circumstance, but an active player in the politics of her age. Fifth, Emma was a great patron of the church and of learning. Her donations rebuilt churches damaged by warfare, supported monasteries and clergy, commissioned the copying of manuscripts, created beautiful artwork. The Encomium itself, whatever its limitations as an objective historical source, is a significant work of literature and historiography, and it would not exist without Emma's patronage. Her religious patronage helped preserve Christianity and learning during a troubled time. Sixth, Emma was mother of kings. Two of her sons became kings of England, Cnut and Edward the Confessor. Through Edward, she was the ancestral grandmother of the line that continued the English royal succession, at least nominally, until William the Conqueror replaced it with his own Norman dynasty. Her descendants and the descendants of her family connections shaped English and European history for centuries after her death. Yet despite all these achievements, Emma's story also reveals the limitations and constraints that shaped medieval women's lives, even for those who were queens. Emma had to work through men, through her husbands, her sons, her brothers, because she could not wield royal power directly in her own name. She could be queen, but not reigning monarch. She could accumulate wealth and influence, but always as queen consort or queen mother, never as ruler in her own right. Emma had to make difficult choices that must have caused her personal anguish. She sent her sons into exile, separating from them for decades, because that was necessary for their safety. She married her first husband's enemy, because that was necessary for her survival and status. She commissioned a historical work that distorted and obscured parts of her own life story, because that was necessary for her political purposes. These choices show both her agency, her ability to make strategic decisions, and her constraints, the limited options available to her given the circumstances. And Emma's story reminds us that even the most powerful and successful people can be forgotten by history if their stories do not fit the narratives that later generations want to tell. Emma was arguably the most important woman in England during the 11th century, yet she was almost completely forgotten for hundreds of years. It is only recently that historians have recovered her story and recognized her significance. How many other important historical figures have been similarly forgotten? How many other stories remain to be rediscovered? As you drift off to sleep tonight, let yourself imagine Emma one last time, in her final years in Winchester. Imagine her as an old woman, her hair white, her face marked by age, but her mind still sharp, her dignity still intact. Imagine her walking through the streets of Winchester, the city she had first come to as a teenage bride 50 years earlier, now so familiar to her after decades of residence. Imagine her attending Mass in the great cathedral, praying for the souls of her dead children and her dead husbands, praying for the peace of the kingdom, praying for her own salvation. But imagine her looking back over her long life, remembering the frightened young girl who had crossed the Channel to marry a foreign king, remembering the triumphs and tragedies, the exiles and restorations, the marriages and births and deaths, the accumulation of wealth and power, the struggles and defeats and victories. What did she think about it all in these quiet moments of reflection? Did she feel satisfied with what she had achieved? Did she regret the choices she had made? Did she wonder how she would be remembered after her death? Imagine her in the evening, sitting by the fire in her chambers, perhaps with a few of her most trusted attendants, comfortable in the familiar surroundings of her household. The day's business is done. The meals have been served. The prayers have been said. There is time now for rest, for quiet conversation, for peaceful contemplation before sleep. The fire crackles gently, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, Winchester settles into night, its streets growing quiet, its people seeking their beds. Let this image of peaceful old age soothe you as you prepare for sleep. Emma, after all her struggles and sorrows, found some peace in her final years. She lived to see one of her sons secure on the English throne. She retained her wealth and status. She was surrounded by her household, by people who had served her loyally for years. She could look forward to burial in the cathedral, with prayers said for her soul, with the hope of eventual reunion in heaven with her departed loved ones. And now, dear listener, let Emma's story fade from your conscious mind. You have travelled with her from her birth in Normandy through all the triumphs and tragedies of her long life to her peaceful death in Winchester. You have seen how one woman navigated the treacherous political waters of the early 11th century, how she survived and thrived and left her mark on history despite all obstacles. Rest now, knowing that history is full of such remarkable stories, of people who faced terrible challenges and found ways to overcome them, of resilience and courage and determination. Dream of ancient Winchester with its great cathedral and its royal palace. Dream of Norman longships crossing the Channel, of Viking raids and English resistance, of crowns placed on royal heads, and of quiet moments of prayer in candlelit churches. Dream of Emma, twice a queen, mother of kings, and one of the most remarkable women of the medieval world. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Queen Emma of Normandy. If you enjoyed this tale of the Double Queen, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Sleepy Crown for more soothing historical documentaries. Share in the comments which aspect of Emma's extraordinary life surprised you most. Perhaps her survival through so many crises, perhaps her political acumen, perhaps her wealth and power, perhaps her complicated relationships with her children. Or let us know which other historical figures you would like to learn about in future episodes. Until next time, sweet dreams, dear listener. May history's gentle whispers continue to carry you into peaceful slumber. Sleep well, and may you rest as peacefully as Emma now rests in Winchester Cathedral. Her struggles ended, her legacy preserved. Good night.